The room smelled of polished mahogany, old paper, and cold coffee, the quiet aromatics of an empire built entirely on calculation. Beneath the green shade of a brass desk lamp, the numbers sat in disciplined rows. Black ink for what had been acquired, red ink for what had been lost. Across the heavy oak desk, two figures sat in the amber stillness of 3 in the morning. The younger man leaned forward, his eyes bright with the fever of an unseen design. He had unrolled a blueprint across the leather blotter, its blue lines arching outward into impossible geometry spires that defied the prevailing wind, glass corridors suspended over ravines, an architecture that treated gravity not as a sovereign master, but as a minor logistical friction. The elder man did not look at the blueprint, he looked at the ledger. With fingers that were dry, precise, and unhurried, the elder tapped the bound spine of the record book. He did not raise his voice. He possessed the terrible, gentle authority of a man who believed he was speaking on behalf of the earth itself. "Look at the column," the elder whispered, his voice like dry leaves dragging across a stone terrace. "Look at the preceding 10 years. Look at the capital reserves, the timber yields, the seasonal labor deficits. What you have drawn here is beautiful, but it is not serious. You must be realistic. You must take the world as it presents itself, not as you wish it to be." The younger man stared at the ledger. In that quiet room, an invisible, catastrophic transaction took place. It was a transaction enacted millions of times every hour across the face of the earth. The living surrendered to the dead. The boundless field of human consciousness, which had just conceived an unbuilt world out of pure nothingness, bowed its head, folded its plans, and allowed a column of dried ink to dictate the boundaries of tomorrow. This is the great, unchallenged altar of the modern mind. From the earliest days of childhood, the human animal is initiated into a cult that calls itself maturity. Its sacrament is pragmatism. Its scripture is the catalogue of past failures. Its cardinal virtue is the willingness to lower one's gaze. When society commands an individual to be realistic, it dresses the demand in the noble robes of wisdom. It speaks with the protective cadence of a father warning a child away from the edge of a cliff. Yet beneath the velvet tone of prudent advice lies the single most sophisticated trap in the human experience. To be realistic, as the world defines it, is to perform an act of profound spiritual backwardness. It is to take the visible, the measurable, the already crystallized form, the debris of choices made months, years, or centuries ago, and elevate those static artifacts into the supreme judges of what can happen next. It is to look at a barren field in the dead of winter and declare that the earth has forgotten how to grow wheat. It is the tragic confusion of the mirror with the face, the echo with the voice, the frozen footprint with the living foot. To dismantle this gilded prison, one must undertake an uncompromising archaeology of the word itself. What is a human being actually doing when they resolve to be realistic? They are engaging in a recursive loop of the mind, a closed circuit of perception that masquerades as rational deduction. Trace the mechanism step by step. First, an individual opens their eyes to their current conditions. They perceive an empty bank account, a fractured relationship, a diagnosis of chronic fatigue, or a small, suffocating room. These conditions possess weight, texture, and undeniable sensory presence. The eyes register the photons, the hands touch the cold plaster of the wall, the nervous system hums with the familiar chemical signature of limitation. Then comes the fatal leap of logic. The mind asks, why are these conditions here? The conventional intellect, trained exclusively in the mechanics of the material surface, answers, they are here because this is the fundamental truth of things. These conditions are the baseline reality, the hard boundaries within which I must now calculate my next move. The recursive cycle immediately locks into place. The moment an individual accepts their current condition as the cause of their reality, they adopt the internal state that corresponds to that condition. If the bank balance is low, they adopt the inner posture of a person who lacks. They walk with the subtle, bracing tension of scarcity. They speak with the unhurried resignation of the denied. They think the frantic, defensive thoughts of the vulnerable. Consciousness, that silent, non-judgmental, utterly obedient substrate of all experience, receives this adopted state. Consciousness does not debate. It does not possess a moral filter that says, this person is suffering, so I shall give them the opposite. It operates with the unbending mathematical fidelity of a mirror. When presented with the visceral assumption of lack, it replies with absolute precision, "Granted." Here is the corresponding materialization. Months later, the external circumstances rearrange themselves to manifest more lack, more dead ends, more evidence of limitation. The individual surveys this fresh harvest of misery, throws their hands in the air, and proclaims to the world, "You see, I was right all along. I knew things were bad, and the universe has proved it. I was just being realistic." They are not being realistic. They are being recursive. They are watching their own assumptions return to them in solid form and mistaking the harvest for an unalterable law of the soil. Why does the intellect fall for this trick with such breathtaking consistency? Because the human mind possesses an ancient, primal terror of disappointment. To hope, to assume a grandeur that the physical senses cannot yet verify, feels like stepping off the edge of a mountain into thin air. It leaves the ego naked, undefended against the mockery of peers and the cold sting of apparent failure. Realism presents itself as psychological body armor. The cynic tells himself, "If I expect nothing, I can never be crushed. If I assume the world is small, I will never look foolish for reaching for the stars." Thus, realism is revealed for what it truly is. Not courage, not wisdom, not intellectual rigor, but fear organized into a philosophy. It is the desperate strategy of a wounded ego attempting to control the pain of life by preemptively surrendering to its lowest common denominator. When a person insists on consulting only what is to decide what can be, they have handed the chisel of creation over to the stone. They have taken the effect, the frozen residue of yesterday's unconscious assumptions, and crowned it as the supreme cause of tomorrow. In doing so, they commit the only true error possible in consciousness. They worship the shadow and deny the light that cast it. In the maritime archives of a forgotten northern port, there lived an imperial cartographer named Master Valen. For 40 years, Valen had served the crown by preserving and refining the great atlas of the known seas. His maps were masterpieces of vellum and gold leaf. Every reef along the eastern coast was charted to the inch. Every trade current was rendered in flowing cerulean ink. Every lighthouse was marked with its precise candle power. Emperors had conquered continents using Valen's scrolls. Merchants had grown unimaginably wealthy by following his ink across the sapphire deep. Valen was revered as the ultimate realist of the maritime world, a man who dealt only in verifiable bathymetry, measurable coastlines, and undeniable land masses. To the western edge of the great atlas, however, the vellum abruptly ended. Beyond the 30th meridian, the parchment was left entirely blank, bordered by a heavy, unbroken line of iron gall ink. Across that dark boundary, Valen's predecessors had etched 3 words in severe Latin script: nulla, ultra, terra, no land beyond. One autumn evening, a young deep-sea captain named Kalen entered the cartographer's sanctum. Kalen was weather-beaten, his salt-encrusted coat smelling of squalls and open water. He did not come with gold to buy maps. He came with a logbook bound in seal leather. "Master Valen," the captain said, setting his battered logbook upon the polished drafting table, 300 miles west of your iron line, the currents do not circle back as your charts claim. They warm. The water turns from slate to the color of crushed lapis lazuli. Flocks of white-winged terns crossed our bow at dawn, flying westward toward high ground. There is an archipelago out there, a continent perhaps. The land is calling, but our navigators refuse to sail into the blank parchment. They look at your maps and turn the helm back toward the shoals. Valen did not open the captain's logbook. He placed his dry, ink-stained palm over the leather cover and smiled with the gentle, crushing pity of a seasoned scholar. "Captain," Valen said softly, "I have surveyed the journals of every navigator who has sailed from this harbor since the founding of the dynasty. 200 voyages have pushed toward that perimeter. 180 turned back, depleted of water. 20 were broken upon the western rocks. The ledger is complete. The physics of the ocean are established. To suggest that a fertile empire lies in the western void is a dangerous fantasy that will cost young men their lives. Have you sailed there?" Kalen asked, his gaze fixed on the old man's pale eyes. "Have you stood at the bowsprit and smelled the offshore cedar in the dark?" "I do not need to drown to understand the nature of the sea," Valen replied with cold dignity. "I look at the accumulated data. I study the proven geography. I am a realist, Captain. I map the world as it exists, not as your longings imagine it to be." Kalen stepped back from the desk. He picked up his seal leather logbook and walked to the high, arched window that overlooked the harbor. Down below, dozens of trading vessels sat locked in the crowded bay, their hulls scraping against one another in the shallow, overfished water, their captains fighting over dwindling cargoes, their crews sick with harbor rot. They were confined to a dying coastline, not by chains, but by the lines on Valen's parchment. "You believe you are recording the world, Master Valen," Kalen said quietly, his hand resting on the brass latch of the door. "You do not see that you are manufacturing it. Your map does not describe our limits. It creates them. The ships do not turn back because the sea ends. They turn back because they reach the edge of your imagination, and they mistake your ink for the horizon." Kalen left the chamber that night. He burned the imperial charts in an iron brazier on the quay, gathered a crew of outcasts who had ceased to care about the approval of sensible men, and sailed due west into the black, unmapped water. 16 months later, when the timber on the eastern coast had grown scarce, and the harbor was choked with bankrupt merchants clinging to their ledgers, a three-masted schooner appeared on the western horizon. Its holds were heavy with fragrant spices unknown to imperial botany. Its decks were adorned with golden timber that did not rot in salt water. Its crew carried the serene, unhurried demeanor of men who had discovered that the edge of the world was merely an arbitrary line drawn by an old man in a windowless room. Master Valen looked out from his tower at the returning vessel. He did not celebrate. He reached for his quill, his hands trembling with a sudden, horrifying comprehension. The blank vellum had never been empty. It had only been waiting for a mind courageous enough to refuse the jurisdiction of the map. The ledger of your own life lies open before you at this very moment. Its entries are vivid and persuasive. It shows the balance of your accounts, the history of your heartbreaks, the genetic tendencies of your lineage, the quiet compromises you have made in order to survive in a world that demands your smallness. Every voice of authority you have ever known, the teachers, the accountants, the cautious friends, the well-meaning parents, stands behind you, pointing at those columns of dried ink, whispering the ancient, paralyzing mantra, "Be realistic. Settle for what the ledger allows." Tonight, the jurisdiction of that ledger ends. To break the recursive cycle of realism does not require a violent war against your circumstances. You do not need to smash the mirror to change the reflection. You need only understand that the mirror possesses no creative power of its own. It is completely, utterly, helplessly dependent on the face standing before it. Begin tonight with a radical, private act of sovereign refusal. Identify the single condition in your life that currently screams the loudest for your attention, the debt that terrifies you, the loneliness that hollows your chest, the professional ceiling that seems cast in iron. Look at it squarely. Acknowledge its sensory presence. Do not pretend the paper does not exist, and do not waste your vital energy cursing the ink. Instead, speak to that condition the only truth it cannot survive. You are not my cause. You are merely my past residue. You are the echo of an assumption I have already outgrown. I give you no authority to tell me what is possible next. Strip the circumstance of its crown. The moment you recognize that your bank account, your relationship status, and your physical limitations are nothing more than the physical precipitation of old mental habits, they lose their power to intimidate you. They cease to be walls. They become nothing more than dissolving mist. Turn your back on the residue. Relocate your awareness entirely to the invisible realm of pure potential, the unmapped ocean that lies beyond your 30th meridian. Do not ask how the new continent will appear. Do not consult the old maps to find a route to a land that the mapmaker insisted did not exist. Simply assume the reality of the harbor on the other side. Dwell in the quiet, settled certainty that the new territory is already real within the sovereign geography of your consciousness. Yet, as you resolve to turn away from the ledger, a deeper and more mechanical question arises. If the visible world is truly nothing more than frozen residue, what is the precise engine that precipitates this solid matter from the invisible? Why does the mirror obey your internal state with such unswerving mathematical precision while ignoring your loudest hopes and most desperate wishes? The answer lies in understanding the difference between the voice and the echo, the sovereign architecture of cause and residue, which we must now step into the laboratory of the mind to fully reveal. A solitary traveler stood in the quiet dust of an attic gallery, holding a small silver halide photograph beneath a shaft of pale afternoon light. The image depicted a garden in full, explosive summer. Heavy damask roses leaned over stone balustrades, sunbeams cut through the canopy of an orchard, a crystal fountain scattered diamonds into the warm air. The detail was absolute. Every drop of water, every vein on the rose petals, every shadow beneath the leaves was rendered with crystalline, unshakable certainty. Yet, as the traveler looked out through the dormer window behind him, the garden outside was buried under 3 feet of unbroken blue-gray snow. The branches of the apple trees were black and skeletal. The fountain was a mute block of solid ice. If this traveler were to step out into the freezing wind, kneel upon the snowdrifts, and demand that the frost become warm simply because the photograph in his palm was bright, the world would deem him insane. If he were to scream at the ice, stroke the silver emulsion with his frozen fingertips, and beg the glossy paper to breathe heat back into the soil, his effort would yield only frostbite and despair. The photograph is not the garden. The photograph is a chemical artifact, a static, frozen monument to a light that vanished long ago. It is the finished, unalterable consequence of a shutter that clicked, captured an instant, and closed forever. Yet across the globe, in every tower of finance, every quiet bedroom, and every corridor of human ambition, billions of conscious beings perform this precise insanity every single day. They open the digital portal of a bank account, stare at the balance, and believe they are looking at their financial reality. They walk into an empty house, feel the hollow ache of solitude, and believe they are surveying the permanent measure of their lovability. They examine a ledger, a medical readout, or the cold indifference of an estranged companion, and they declare, "This is my life. This is the truth of who I am." They do not see that they are clutching a photograph. Every single circumstance that can be seen, heard, weighed, touched, or measured is already dead. It has already happened. It is the physical precipitation, the crystallized residue, the chemical deposit of what an individual was assuming, feeling, and quietly accepting as the nature of existence months or years prior. To look at the residue of yesterday, call it reality, and then allow that residue to dictate what one dares to imagine for tomorrow is the catastrophic error that holds human destiny in chains. It is the tragic inversion of the cosmos, taking the cold footprint in the snow and demanding that it tell the living foot where it is permitted to walk. To master the mechanics of reality, one must tear away the veil of appearance and trace the causal sequence from its invisible root to its visible fruit. Why does humanity remain perpetually trapped in cycles of stagnation, repeating the same emotional and financial patterns under different names and in different rooms? The trap springs from a single fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between consciousness and circumstance. The untrained intellect assumes a linear, materialistic progression. The outer circumstance occurs, the senses perceive it, the mind forms an emotion, identity is established. Under this false model, an individual believes they must wait for money to appear before they can feel abundant. They believe they must wait for romantic devotion to arrive before they can feel cherished. They believe the external world is the primary engine, the great roaring factory of causes, while their inner life is merely an emotional reactive chamber tossed about like a cork on the surface of an uncaring sea. This is the ultimate cosmic reversal. The true sequence operates in the exact opposite direction. The internal assumption is adopted consciousness, accepts it as fact. The subtle energy aligns, the outer circumstance precipitates as residue. Consider how physical precipitation works in the natural world. Invisible moisture gathers in the atmosphere. It cannot be seen by the naked eye. It cannot be held in the hand. It registers neither weight nor shadow upon the ground. Yet, under the influence of pressure and temperature, that invisible vapor undergoes a phase transition. It condenses into heavy clouds, and eventually it falls to the earth as rain, hail, or snow. When a snowflake lands on a stone, it has transitioned from the invisible realm of potential into the dense, frozen realm of form. Your physical circumstances are nothing more than psychological snow. The bank balance, the physical ailments, the social circle, the level of professional influence, none of these things possess self-generating power. They have no sovereign intelligence. They cannot choose to expand, contract, heal, or wither on their own. They are the frozen forms of your past internal climate. They are the solidified physical residue of the invisible assumptions you entertained in the dark, unguarded corridors of your mind while driving your car, washing your dishes, and drifting off to sleep. Why then does the residue appear so stubbornly permanent? Because the moment the residue solidifies, the individual commits the fatal error of crowning the effect. When the frozen circumstance appears, the individual looks at it and says, "This is the cause of my sorrow. This empty balance is the cause of my stress. This failing relationship is the cause of my unworthiness." By naming the effect a cause, the mind instantly adopts the internal state that matches the circumstance. The individual feels poor because the paper says so. The individual feels unloved because the room is quiet. Now, observe the recursive tragedy. Consciousness, which knows no master other than your own accepted assumptions, looks upon this fresh surrender to limitation. It does not judge, it does not argue, it does not intervene. It operates with the unyielding mathematical neutrality of gravity. It receives the assumption, "I am lacking, I am denied, I am fragile," and begins the process of condensing that assumption into tomorrow's physical forms. The individual looks at tomorrow's fresh lack and cries, "I knew it. The world remains against me. The law has not failed." The law has operated with terrifying, flawless perfection. The machine of reality did not glitch. It produced the exact harvest of the seed that was sown. The tragedy is that the gardener spent his days worshipping the weeds of yesterday, throwing their seeds back into the furrow and weeping that the soil refused to yield wheat. In the high mountain kingdom of Oakhaven, the royal sculptor, Master Theron, was summoned to the grand plaza before the imperial palace. The king stood before a colossal raw monolith of translucent white marble that had been dragged from the deepest quarries of the northern mountains. The stone was 40 cubits high, rough-hewn, jagged, and imposing. "Theron," the king commanded, his voice echoing across the courtyard, "within this stone lies the eternal spirit of our lineage, the radiant sovereign. You have 12 months. If by the winter solstice you have not brought forth the living grace of the sovereign from this rock, your life is forfeit." Theron bowed, set up his scaffolding, and moved his bed into the shadow of the stone. For the first 4 months, Theron did not strike the rock with a single tool. He sat upon the timber platforms at dawn, at noon, and at midnight. He ran his hands along the cold grain of the stone, his eyes closed. In the silent, unlit theater of his mind, he walked around the finished statue. He saw the gentle curve of the sovereign's robes. He felt the texture of the carved laurel wreath. He traced the serene, unbothered expression of the mouth. He dwelled with the finished work so intimately that when he opened his eyes to the raw, jagged rock, the rock looked like a thin, transparent illusion draped over an already completed masterpiece. In the 5th month, Theron raised his mallet and iron chisel. The courtyard filled with the rhythmic, ringing music of iron striking stone. Clink, clank, strike. Great slabs of rough stone fell to the flagstones. White marble dust billowed into the air like cloud banks, settling over the scaffolding, covering Theron's hair, filling the cracks of his boots. Day after day, week after week, the debris accumulated. Heaps of broken rock, sharp shards, and mounds of fine white powder rose around the base of the scaffolding until the lower third of the monolith was entirely buried beneath the gray-white waste. In the 9th month, the king's chief minister, an arrogant man named Vane, who took pride in his fiscal pragmatism, entered the plaza, accompanied by his clerks. Vane looked at the scene and recoiled in horror. "Stop the work!" Vane shouted, waving his embroidered sleeves at the choking dust. "Theron, you have ruined the royal commission. Look at this courtyard. There are 10 tons of useless broken debris suffocating the royal gates. The stones are shattered. The ground is ruined. The air is unbreathable. You have produced nothing but rubble and waste." Theron climbed down from the 3rd tier of the scaffolding. He stood covered in chalky dust, his face calm, his mallet resting lightly in his calloused hand. "Lord Vane," Theron said quietly, "you are looking at the dust." "Of course I am looking at the dust." Vane sneered, kicking a pile of marble shards across the flagstones. "The dust is what currently exists. It is visible. It is heavy. It fills my shoes and ruins my silk. This mess is the undeniable reality of your work." "No," Theron replied, his voice ringing with the quiet authority of an artist who knew the law of form. "The debris you see is not the work. It is merely the residue of where the chisel has already been. It is the dead material falling away from an image that was finished in my soul 5 months ago." If you spend your time measuring the piles of dust, cursing the debris, and trying to paste the chips back onto the block, you will miss the sovereign emerging beneath the veil. Theron turned his back on the chief minister, ascended the timber ladder, and struck the chisel once more. With every strike, more residue cascaded to the earth, not as an enemy, but as the natural, necessary byproduct of a higher form claiming its space in the physical world. On the morning of the winter solstice, the palace gates swung open. The king, Lord Vane, and the entire court walked into the plaza. The mounds of dust had been swept to the perimeter. Rising out of the morning mist stood the radiant sovereign, breathtaking, luminous, carved with such delicate, breathing vitality that the marble seemed warmer than human flesh. The court fell silent, weeping at the majesty of the form. Lord Vane stared in silence, unable to comprehend how 10 months of suffocating dust and broken rocks had culminated in an altar of timeless beauty. He had judged the process by the debris, blind to the sovereign vision that governed every blow of the iron. Every difficulty, every delay, and every frustrating circumstance currently occupying your life is nothing more than the marble dust of your past mental strikes. When you look at your current life, you are looking at the debris falling from the scaffolding. The unpaid bill, the awkward silence between you and someone you care for, the lingering habit of self-doubt, these are not active verdicts on your capacity or worth. They are the chemical residue of an older vision of yourself that is currently being chiseled away. To achieve total sovereignty over your experience, you must immediately enact the disenthronement protocol. 1. Stop negotiating with the debris. Cease all emotional arguments with your current conditions. When an unfavorable circumstance presents itself today, refuse to validate it with dramatic energy. Do not fight it, do not bargain with it, and do not use it as evidence that your life is off course. Treat it with the dispassionate recognition of a sculptor glancing at a chip of rock on the floor. Acknowledge it, whisper to yourself, "This is only the residue of what was," and let it fall. 2. Relocate the throne of cause. Transfer your entire sense of causation back to the invisible sanctuary of your own consciousness. Remind yourself that no condition outside of you possesses a heartbeat, a will, or an engine. The condition is an echo. You are the voice. The condition is the shadow. You are the light. If you wish to change the shape of the shadow on the wall, it is a waste of time to run to the wall and try to push the darkness into a new shape. You simply move the hand that stands before the lamp. 3. Inhabit the finished monument. Like Master Theron sitting before the uncarved rock, you must spend your inner hours walking through the finished reality of your desire. Do not look at what you want from the outside, longing for it across a gulf of time. Step inside it. Feel the weight of the air in the room where your prayer is already answered. Feel the relaxed rhythm of your pulse when the crisis has already been resolved. Dwell there until that inner reality becomes far more solid, familiar, and persuasive than the marble dust falling around your feet. When you master this distinction between cause and residue, a strange and exhilarating freedom washes over your existence. The world loses its power to terrorize you. You no longer walk through your days bracing for impact. You walk through them as an architect walking through a construction site, looking past the exposed girders and wet concrete to the finished palace that is already guaranteed. Yet, this brings us to an even deeper, more challenging threshold. If our assumptions are the sole cause of our physical residue, why do we find ourselves returning to the assumptions of lack, fear, and struggle with such mechanical, effortless devotion? Why does the human mind seem to possess an instinctive, unbreakable fidelity to the very conditions it claims it wants to escape? The answer reveals a shocking truth about human nature. You have never lacked faith for a single second of your life. You have merely been worshipping an unwanted altar with the devotion of a saint. To break that unconscious devotion, we must now step into the inner sanctuary to examine the inescapable engine of faith. The alarm rings in the dark, cold hours before the sun. Before the eyes have even cleared the film of sleep, before the feet have touched the cold pine floorboards, the liturgy begins. It does not require words. It requires no hymnal, no candle, no congregation. It operates as a wordless, automatic pulse through the nervous system. The hand reaches out and grasps the glass screen of a phone. In the harsh blue glare that illuminates the dark room, the brow contracts. The chest tightens by half an inch. The shoulders rise toward the ears, locking into place like iron shields. In the span of 6 seconds, an entire theological system is enacted without a single deliberate thought. The mind surveys the day ahead and whispers its creed: there will not be enough time. The resources will run dry before the obligations are met. The people in that office will misunderstand me. The friction is inevitable. The exhaustion is permanent. Observe this person closely. They do not think of themselves as religious. If asked, they might profess a cool agnosticism or explain that they are purely secular, rational, and grounded in empirical facts. They will tell anyone who asks that they desperately want their life to be peaceful, abundant, and free, yet their actions tell an entirely different story. With the rigorous, unbroken discipline of a cloistered monk chanting the dawn prayers, they offer their first conscious moments of the day to the certainty of lack. They walk to the bathroom mirror and gaze into their own eyes with the profound conviction that they are missing something vital. They enter the kitchen, pour their coffee, and review their worries not as mere possibilities, but as absolute, unshakable truths that demand their total vigilance. Here is the supreme paradox of the human condition. Humanity believes it suffers from a lack of faith. Spiritual teachers lament its absence. Seekers travel to distant mountains to acquire it. Desperate souls pray for it, as though it were a rare, golden coin dropped from the heavens into the laps of a chosen few. They are entirely wrong. No human being has ever lacked faith for a single millisecond of their existence. Faith is not an achievement. It is not a virtue earned through suffering or study. Faith is the fundamental, non-negotiable operating system of human consciousness. It is an engine that does not possess an off switch. The individual who lives in chronic poverty, terrorized by the arrival of the morning mail, does not lack faith. They possess towering, monumental, unshakable faith in scarcity. They believe in the power of debt with a purity of devotion that would put the greatest martyrs to shame. The person who finds themselves repeatedly abandoned in love does not suffer from doubt. They possess a crystalline, flawless faith in their own unworthiness. They walk into every room with their heart wide open to rejection, absolutely certain of its arrival, faithfully orchestrating the exact conditions required for their own heartbreak. The tragedy is not that humanity is faithless. The tragedy is that humanity places its faith with the devotion of saints in the very prisons it prays to escape. To comprehend this inescapable mechanism, one must strip the word faith of all religious sentimentality and inspect its raw psychological machinery. What is faith when reduced to its operational essence? Faith is the mind's unexamined consent to a premise. It is the deep, visceral conviction that a specific state of affairs is the true baseline of reality. It is not what an individual they believe during a pleasant conversation. It is the silent, gravitational baseline to which their thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations automatically return when they are not paying attention. Why is the human mind incapable of operating without faith? Because the intellect cannot perceive reality in its raw, unmediated state. The universe presents an infinite, overwhelming torrent of sensory data, every second billions of photons, frequencies, and variables. To function without collapsing into madness, the human instrument must organize this chaos through a perceptual lens. That lens is built out of assumptions. An assumption is an act of faith. It is an internal decree that says, this is what the world is, this is who I am, this is what is possible for someone like me. Once this baseline assumption is accepted, the mind enters a state of absolute fidelity to it. Consider the recursive anatomy of this process, the unconscious premise. An assumption is accepted, usually inherited from childhood, cultural trauma, or an unexamined past failure, e.g., resources are scarce and must be fought for with grueling struggle. The perceptual filter. The reticular activating system of the brain, acting as the biological servant of this assumption, filters out all evidence of ease, unexpected abundance, and effortless grace. It highlights only the friction, the competition, and the threat. The emotional consecration. The individual feels the anxiety of this filtered reality. They mistake the feeling for objective truth. They say, I feel the struggle, therefore the struggle is real. The behavioral alignment. Operating from this visceral certainty of struggle, they act defensively. They hoard, they hesitate, they overexert, they repel collaboration, and they create the exact relational friction they feared. The The final confirmation. When the project collapses under the weight of this friction, the individual points to the wreckage and says, "I knew it. I was right to be afraid." Notice the absolute perfection of the loop. The faith was flawless. The assumption went forth into the invisible field of potential, organized the neural pathways, dictated the hormonal cascades, steered the physical actions, and returned to the individual with a harvest precisely identical to the seed. How does the mind justify this tragic fidelity to suffering? It justifies it through the seductive illusion of emotional safety. The ego believes that if it assumes the worst, it can never be surprised by tragedy. To assume poverty feels safer than assuming wealth, because if poverty occurs, the ego remains intact as a wise predictor of reality. If wealth is assumed and does not immediately manifest in physical form, the ego risks the agony of looking foolish, the humiliation of exposed longing. Thus, the human animal chooses the predictable hell of familiar limitation over the terrifying, unmapped wilderness of its own sovereign power. It worships the altar of its current conditions because the conditions, however painful, are known. They have an address. They have a history. Humanity bows down to its chains, not because it loves bondage, but because it has practiced wearing them for so long that the weight of the iron feels like the natural contour of the bone. In the arid valley of Mordrak, nestled between jagged mountains of black slate, lay the ancient city of Kael'Varn. For 300 years, the people of Kael'Varn lived under the shadow of the Sky Citadel, a colossal windowless temple built upon the highest peak of the valley. The temple had been erected to appease the god of the Iron Hail, a wrathful deity who, according to ancient legend, would crush the city beneath burning stones if his altar ever grew cold. Every evening at dusk, as the bells of the citadel tolled with a heavy, hollow bronze clatter, the citizens of Kael'Varn dropped to their knees in the dusty streets. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Mothers pulled their children to the stone tiles. Elders bowed their heads until their foreheads pressed against the earth. Together in a low, terrifying unison that made the very ground vibrate, 10,000 voices chanted the litany of ruin. The stone is heavy. The sky is cruel. We are small beneath the iron cloud. Let the hammer spare our roofs tonight, for we are dust and worth nothing. Every month the city sent its finest livestock, its purest olive oil, and its rarest woven tapestries up the winding mountain path to be burned in the temple's great stone ovens. The smoke from these sacrifices rose in thick, greasy black plumes that permanently choked the sun, casting the valley into a perpetual freezing twilight. The crops withered in the shadow, the children grew pale and sick, the water in the wells tasted of ash. Yet the high priests of the city walked among the people with solemn pride, pointing to the misery as proof of their piety. "Look at our devotion," the high priest Nathan would say, his linen robes stained with sacrificial soot. "See how faithfully we honor the master of our sky. Because of our vigilance, the iron hail has not fallen today. We must remain steadfast in our humility. We must never allow our faith to waver." Among the stonecutters of Kael'Varn lived a young woman named Elysia. Her hands were scarred from splitting granite, and her lungs burned with the smoke of the endless sacrifices. One night, while the city lay bowed in the streets chanting the litany of ruin, Elysia did not kneel. She stood alone among the prostrate bodies, looking up at the black plumes of smoke billowing from the mountain peak. She felt the absurdity of the ritual strike her chest not as a theory, but as an intolerable, burning fire. "We call this fear," she thought, watching an elder weep against the cobblestones. "We call this humility, but it is not humility, it is worship. We are spending every drop of our blood, our wealth, and our breath to keep this horror alive." Under the cover of the midnight mist, while the city slept in its accustomed exhaustion, Elysia began the ascent to the Sky Citadel. The path was treacherous, carved into sheer cliffs of slate. When she reached the summit at dawn, she found the massive bronze gates of the temple unlocked, hanging slightly ajar. The priests had long since ceased to guard them. No citizen had ever dared to approach the sanctuary of the wrathful god. Elysia pushed the heavy gates open. They groaned on rusted hinges, the sound echoing into the vast, cavernous interior. She stepped across the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs, bracing herself to be struck down by lightning or crushed beneath falling stone. She moved down the central aisle, past towering pillars of obsidian, toward the Holy of Holies, where the deity was said to reside upon an iron throne. The sanctuary was empty. There was no god on the throne. There was no spirit of wrath waiting to consume the valley. In the center of the vast chamber stood only a colossal, mechanical hearth, an ingenious system of iron bellows, chimney flues, and coal chutes designed by the city's founders centuries ago. A small team of tired, soot-covered old men moved mechanically between the hoppers, shoveling black coal into the roaring flames to keep the smoke pouring from the roof vents. Elysia walked up to the master of the hearth, an old man whose eyes were cloudy with cataracts. "Where is the god?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the hiss of the bellows. The old man turned slowly, leaning on his iron shovel. He did not look angry. He looked infinitely weary. "There is no god here, child," he said softly. "There has never been a god here. There is only the fire and the smoke that the city sends us the fuel to make." "Then why do you burn it?" Elysia cried, pointing toward the valley below. "The people are starving. The sky is choked. You are killing our city." The old man smiled with a tragic, gentle pity. "We do not burn the coal to appease a god, young one. We burn the coal because the city brings it to our gates every morning. If the people stopped bringing the oil, the tapestry, and the grain, the fire would die in an hour, the smoke would clear, the sun would return." The old man pointed a soot-stained finger down through an arched window toward the valley, where the first morning bells were beginning to toll, and thousands of figures were already dropping to their knees in the dust. "The temple does not rule Kyle Varn," the keeper whispered. "Kyle Varn rules the temple. Their terror is the fuel. Their chants are the air that feeds the bellows. They are not victims of the darkness. They are its architects. They have given their entire lives to this altar, and they call their chains devotion. Look closely at the smoking altars of your own life. What are the chants you repeat to yourself when no one is listening? What are the sacrifices you make every morning to the gods of limitation, fatigue, and unworthiness? You must understand this with absolute, unsparing clarity. You do not need to learn how to have faith. You are already a master of faith. You have exercised it with Olympic discipline every day you have walked this earth. You have had absolute faith that the floorboards would hold you when you stepped out of bed. You have had faith that the gravity of the earth would not dissolve. And you have had terrifying, immaculate faith in the permanence of your problems. The work before you is not the acquisition of a new power. It is the sovereign reclamation and redirection of a power you have been misusing in the dark. To redirect this engine today, execute the following protocol. 1. Identify your unconscious liturgy. Take 5 minutes in complete stillness. Notice the baseline assumption you bring to your primary area of struggle. What is the automatic phrase that arises when you think about your finances, your body, or your deepest desire? Is it, "It's always a fight"? Is it, "People always leave"? Is it, "I came too late"? Write that phrase down. Look at it not as a fact, but as an ancient smoke sacrifice you have been faithfully delivering to an empty room. 2. Declare the temple empty. Look at that old assumption and say aloud, "I see you. You are not a law of the universe. You are only a fire. I have been feeding with my own attention. The altar is empty. The God has no power. I cut off the fuel today." 3. Direct the engine to the new altar. Since your consciousness cannot remain neutral, you must give it a new assignment immediately. Choose the assumption that matches the life you were born to live. Not as an anxious wish whispered through clenched teeth, but as a sovereign decree. If you have been worshipping the altar of exhaustion, assume the state of vibrant, inexhaustible vitality. If you have been worshipping scarcity, assume the calm, unbothered posture of someone whose resources are as boundless as the air they breathe. Do not ask how the conditions will change. That is not your business. Your only task is to withdraw your faith from the smoke, place it entirely upon the new reality, and refuse to drop to your knees when the old fear bells ring. When you begin this practice, however, you will immediately encounter an astonishing phenomenon. You will stand before the mirror of reality with your new assumption, and for a moment the world will seem to look back at you with cold, mocking defiance. It will present you with the exact same reflections you have seen for years. Why does this happen? How does the creative substance of consciousness actually receive an internal assumption and translate it into a physical life? What are the invisible physics that govern the relationship between the observer and the glass? To answer this, we must shatter the final illusion of external authority and gaze directly into the laws of the obedient cosmos, the mirror of creative consciousness. A grand gilded dressing room stood shrouded in the amber quiet of midnight. Before a towering pier glass framed in carved acanthus leaves, an aristocrat stood in complete, suffocating agitation. The silvered backing of the mirror was ancient and unclouded, reflecting every thread of his velvet doublet, the heavy gold chain upon his breast, and the deep furrowed scowl etched across his forehead. His lips were pressed into a severe downward arc. His jaw was locked like an iron vice. With trembling hands, the man reached into a lacquer box on the dressing table, withdrew a horsehair brush and a pot of vermilion cosmetic paint, and stepped forward until his breath misted the cold glass. He began to paint upon the mirror. With frantic, sweeping strokes, he smeared the red pigment across the glass surface, attempting to draw a wide, radiant smile directly over the mouth of his reflection. He stepped back to survey his work. The painted vermilion smile sat on the glass, bright and artificial, but beneath the grease and pigment, the true reflection remained entirely unchanged. The silver image still stared back at him with the same dark, miserable scowl, made only more grotesque by the clownish red smear hovering before it. The man grew furious. He struck the glass with the palm of his hand, cursing the mirror for its stubbornness. He reasoned with it, he begged it, he promised it vast fortunes if it would only soften its eyes and show him a countenance of joy. He brought candles closer to illuminate the frame. He hired attendants to polish the edges. He rearranged the heavy velvet drapes around the room to change the angle of the light. Yet the mirror did not yield. It could not yield. The silver glass possessed no will of its own. It harbored no malice against the aristocrat, nor did it favor his enemies. It had no capacity to decide, to alter, to initiate, or to compromise. It was a completely neutral, utterly obedient instrument of reflection. As long as the man stood before the glass with his brow furrowed in misery, the mirror had no choice in the cosmos but to return to him a face of sorrow with mathematical, unforgiving precision. This is the exact theater of madness enacted by humanity every hour of every day. The modern individual looks out into the world and perceives conflict in their home, stagnation in their enterprise, or scarcity in their life. What is their immediate instinctive response? They run to the glass with paintbrushes and hammers. They throw their energy into manipulating the reflection. They argue with the circumstances. They maneuver, manipulate, hustle, beg, bribe, and complain. They expend their finite life force trying to force the external world to smile while their inner countenance remains twisted in the sour, defensive certainty of lack. They never look away from the glass long enough to realize the simplest, most devastating truth of existence. The reflection is not where the choice lives. The choice lives exclusively in the one who stands before it. To comprehend why the world behaves with such unyielding resistance when approached from the outside, one must understand the fundamental physics of the creative mirror. Consciousness is the sole irreducible substance of all manifested reality. It is not an abstract byproduct of the human brain. It is the living, universal medium in which galaxies, atoms, and daily circumstances take their form. This creative substance possesses one absolute, non-negotiable operational law. It reflects back in outer form whatever is accepted as true in inner form. Trace the recursive mechanics of how human beings mistake this obedience for an independent external assault, the neutral transmission. The individual quietly, habitually assumes a state of consciousness. They do not merely think a passing thought. They embody an assumption with feeling the settled, unexamined inner conviction that resources are scarce, that they are destined to be overlooked, or that life is an endless, grueling siege. The absolute mirroring, consciousness receives this internal broadcast. It does not judge the moral worth of the assumption. It does not say, this person is good, so I will give them peace, even though they are broadcasting war. It possesses no personal preferences, no anger, and no mercy. Like the laws of mathematics or thermodynamics, it simply executes its nature. It responds with unconditional obedience. It says, granted. Here is the exact material equivalent, the emergence of evidence. The external world, which is nothing more than consciousness slowed down into tangible density, begins to arrange itself. Colleagues become difficult. Opportunities evaporate at the 11th hour. Unexpected expenses materialize. The tragic recursion. The individual looks upon this newly crystallized evidence and commits the crowning folly of human reasoning. They point at the outer circumstance and say, I am justified in feeling anxious because look at how difficult my life is. Why is this deduction so catastrophically backward? Because it mistakes the reflected image for the primary cause. When an individual uses the external reflection as the justification for their internal state, they enter an airtight, self-perpetuating cycle of limitation. The reflection dictates the mood. The mood solidifies the assumption commands the mirror produces more reflection. Why does consciousness never intervene to save an individual from their own self-inflicted misery? Because to intervene would be to violate the supreme law of free will. If consciousness were to contradict your inner assumption, it would strip you of your nature as a creative center of life. It honors you so profoundly that it grants you the total, terrifying power to define your own reality. If you choose to define yourself as a victim, unconsciousness will organize the entire cosmos to provide you with a masterclass in victimization. It will recruit the necessary actors, orchestrate the necessary delays, and align the necessary frictions to ensure that your assumption is validated to the letter. Consciousness is not punishing you, it is obeying you with the fidelity of a dog and the precision of an atomic clock. When you understand this, the entire architecture of blame dissolves into thin air. You realize that you have never been fighting an unfair world, an unlucky star, or an uncooperative society. You have only ever been wrestling with the reflection of your own unexamined inner convictions. In the desert kingdom of Qadira, there reigned an emperor named Malik who had ascended the throne through a bloody and tumultuous succession. Though his borders were secure and his granaries overflowed with wheat, Malik could not sleep. His mind was an impenetrable fortress of suspicion. He lived in the absolute, bone-deep certainty that every man in his court was a disguised assassin and that every smile masked a dagger dipped in venom. Every morning, Malik sat upon his throne of hammered brass, scanning the Grand Divan with cold, predatory eyes. When his Grand Vizier, an old and loyal servant of 3 dynasties, bowed low and presented a scroll detailing a trade treaty with the southern tribes, Malik did not read the terms. He looked at the slight tremor in the old man's hand and thought, he is nervous because he has taken gold from my enemies. He wants to drain my treasury. When his captain of the guard brought 500 captured horses to the palace gates, shouting praises for the emperor's might, Malik narrowed his eyes and thought, he gathers soldiers and beasts to his own banner. He prepares the garrison to storm the inner palace. Every word of counsel was heard as deceit. Every gesture of loyalty was seen as a feint. Operating from this unshakable assumption of betrayal, Malik enacted his prudent defenses. He dismissed his most competent generals. He placed spies behind every tapestry in the palace. He intercepted the personal letters of his ministers. He executed 3 provincial governors whose tax returns were merely delayed by winter floods. He doubled the royal guard, surrounded himself with foreign mercenaries who cared nothing for the realm and ate only food that had been tested on 3 condemned prisoners. For 5 years, Malik fought a ceaseless, exhausting war against the shadows. Then, on a cold night in the month of the winter moon, the inevitable occurred. The Grand Vizier, the remaining nobles, and the captain of the guard met in secret within the subterranean vaults of the city. They were not wicked men. They had loved the empire and had sought to serve it with honor, but they had reached the limits of human endurance. They had watched their innocent brothers executed, their honors stripped, and their families threatened by a monarch who could not be appeased. The emperor has gone mad, the Grand Vizier whispered, his hands trembling over an unrolled map of the palace. He suspects us of treason every hour of the day. If we do not strike tonight, his mercenaries will have our heads before dawn. We must take the throne to save our own lives. Before the 3rd watch of the night, the palace gates were unbarred from within. The nobles marched through the corridors, disarmed the foreign mercenaries, and surrounded the royal bedchamber. Malik was dragged from his bed in his nightclothes, his hands bound with rough hemp rope. He looked upon the drawn swords of his ministers, his generals, and his closest kin. He did not tremble. A grim, twisted smile of supreme vindication spread across his face. He looked at the Grand Vizier and spat upon the marble floor. "I knew it," Malik roared, his voice ringing against the vaulted stone. From the very day I sat upon the throne, I saw the deceit in your eyes. I told the court you were traitors. I knew this dagger was waiting for me. I was right all along. I was the only one who saw things as they truly were. The old Grand Vizier looked down at the fallen emperor, his eyes heavy with an infinite sorrowful pity. You were not right, Malik, the vizier whispered, sheathing his sword. When you sat upon the throne, there was not a single man in this empire who would not have laid down his life for your honor. We loved you as a father. But you demanded our treachery. You hunted it, you smelled it in the clean air, you paid for it with your suspicions, and you gave us no other way to survive. You built this coup with your own hands, stone by stone, and now you congratulate yourself for predicting the ruin you created. Take a moment to pause. If this profound revelation speaks directly to the quiet knowing within you, consider taking a second to like this work and subscribe to this channel. In doing so, you anchor this understanding in your daily life and help build a sanctuary of wisdom for others seeking to awaken from the recursive dream of the senses. Look at the daggers, the walls, and the barren rooms of your current life. Ask yourself the question that takes an extraordinary degree of spiritual adulthood to utter. What have I been quietly demanding from the mirror? If you are honest with yourself, you will see that you have been operating like Emperor Malik. You have assumed that people will let you down, and you have celebrated your intuition when they did. You have assumed that opportunities are scarce and fragile, and you have called yourself a realist when the doors closed in your face. You have been demanding that the reflection change its expression while refusing to alter the scowl on your own face. The war against the glass ends today. To permanently transform the broadcast of your consciousness, enact the Sovereign Mirror Protocol. 1. Cease the physical assault on the glass. Whenever you feel the frantic urge to force a situation, to send 10 panicked messages, to argue with someone's cold behavior, or to frantically manipulate your outer circumstances, stop. Recognize that you are attempting to paint the mirror. Take your hands off the external world. Step back from the glass. 2. Turn directly to the source. Acknowledge that the circumstance before you has no life of its own. It is merely a projection of a past internal state. Shift your attention entirely inward. Ask yourself, what is the face I wish to see in the world? If you wish to see abundance in the glass, you must first assume the posture of the wealthy within the private chambers of your mind. If you wish to see deep, unshakable devotion in others, you must first wear the unbothered sovereign certainty of one who is profoundly loved. 3. Hold the inner expression. Stand before the world with your new internal assumption, completely indifferent to what the glass currently reflects. Do not check the mirror every 5 minutes to see if the image has shifted. A master does not check the mirror to see if he is smiling. He smiles, and he knows with mathematical certainty that the glass has no choice but to follow. When you begin to hold this inner countenance, however, a profound and intoxicating realization will dawn upon you. You will realize that the physical world around you, the chair beneath you, the room that surrounds you, the vast cities of steel and glass is not made of permanent rigid matter at all. Every single bridge, every building, and every law of civilization was once nothing more than a ghost, a mere phantom drifting through the silent, invisible space of a human mind. How does the invisible actually cross the threshold into the visible? What is the secret architecture that allows a pure, unseen thought to harden into stone and steel? To master this supreme alchemy, we must now cross the threshold of the senses and enter the workshop of the gods, the realm of the invisible. Stand at twilight upon the highest terrace of a great metropolis and look down. Beneath the indigo dome of the evening sky, a boundless sea of light and geometric precision stretches to the dark horizon. Suspension bridges hang like spider silk across black rivers, bearing hundreds of thousands of tons of moving steel. Glass towers rise 70 stories into the clouds, their illuminated offices glowing like amber honeycombs. Deep beneath the pavement, subterranean transit lines pulse with electric locomotives, carrying millions of human beings through tunnels carved out of solid bedrock. Above it all, aircraft track invisible highways in the stratosphere, guided by silent radio frequencies slicing through the dark. Take in the sheer, overwhelming mass of it all. The millions of tons of poured concrete, the forged titanium girders, the miles of copper wiring, the complex legal systems operating in the courthouses. the symphonies sounding in the concert halls, the sterile laboratories engineering vaccines down to the molecular bond. Now hold this massive, thundering spectacle in your awareness and confront the staggering, unavoidable paradox at its center. Not a single ounce of this entire civilization was here before someone imagined it. Every bridge was once a fleeting, weightless vapor in the mind of an engineer who sat staring at an empty sheet of paper. Every skyscraper was once a private, unseen geometry drifting through a human skull while the plot of land beneath it was still a swamp of mud and weeds. The language you speak, the chair that supports your spine, the device through which you receive these words, the very concept of liberty etched into stone monuments, every piece of material existence graduated from the invisible to the visible by passing through one single, narrow gateway, the human imagination. Yet, despite living inside an entire universe constructed out of realized daydreams, the average human being treats their inner life as a trivial, inconsequential shadow. They are taught from the cradle that the outer world, the world of invoices, traffic, weather, and physical obstacles, is the real world, the serious arena where life actually happens. The inner world of thought, feeling, and imagination is dismissed as a child's playground, a private, decorative theater to be visited only for entertainment after the real business of surviving has been concluded. They walk through a world built entirely out of solidified imagination while actively denying that their own imagination has any power to build. They live among the monuments of visionary minds, yet they treat their own internal life as an accidental, reactive cinema. They spend their days reacting to the physical echoes of someone else's past imagination, completely blind to the fact that their own invisible interior is the only workshop where their personal universe is being forged. To grasp the primacy of the invisible is to dismantle the deepest, most pervasive superstition of modern materialistic culture, the belief that the physical world possesses independent, self-originating authority. Why does humanity struggle so violently to recognize that the inner realm is the primary cause and the outer realm merely the secondary effect? Because of the biological bias of the human nervous system. The 5 physical senses are designed to be repertorial instruments, not creative ones. The eye can only register photons that have already bounced off an object. The ear can only detect sound waves that have already disturbed the atmosphere. The skin can only sense pressure that is already occurring. By their very biological design, the senses are historians. They can report only on what has already arrived, what has already crystallized, what has already entered the cemetery of form. When an individual makes the sensory report their primary source of information about who they are and what is possible, they lock themselves into an inverted existence. Consider the recursive breakdown of this perceptual tragedy, the external fixation. The individual observes an external lack, e.g., an empty ledger or an empty home. The internal abdication. Instead of consulting their sovereign imagination to conceive a higher state, they allow the sensory report to dictate their internal climate. They feel small, empty, and rejected because the historical report says so. The unconscious seeding. In this state of emotional reaction, their imagination is not idle. Imagination is never idle. Instead, it runs on automatic, projecting vivid scenarios of continued struggle, future humiliation, and inevitable decline. The mind rehearses the hard conversations, feels the sharp sting of future bills, and marinates in the quiet dread of tomorrow. The causal emission. Consciousness receives this vivid, emotionally charged rehearsal as a direct command. It does not treat the rehearsal as a fear to be avoided. It treats it as an architectural blueprint to be executed. The material condensation, the invisible assumption, passes through the phase transition of reality, precipitating as fresh external friction, fresh relational estrangement, fresh scarcity. The blind conclusion. The individual surveys the new wreckage and cries, "My imagination was just a useless fantasy. The real world has proven its cruelty once again. Why is this deduction a total misunderstanding of the causal chain?" Because their imagination did work with terrifying, ruthless precision. It was not their deliberate, polite daydreams that created the disaster. It was the unmonitored, deeply felt, fearful imaginings of their ordinary hours. Creation does not happen in the formal, rigid 15 minutes an individual sets aside for meditation or positive thinking. Creation happens in the unguarded silences of the day. It happens in the quiet sigh let out while opening an email. It happens in the dark, automatic assumption while waiting at a red light that a meeting will go poorly. It happens in the habitual story told in the shower about how difficult it is to be understood. Each of these subtle, unwitnessed internal movements is an act of supreme authorship. Every emotional tone you sustain in the invisible realm is a seed dropped into the soil of consciousness, guaranteed to grow into a physical harvest. Your inner life is not a small private compartment tucked away beneath the heavy machinery of the world. Your inner life is the engine room of the universe. The outer world is merely the dial on the dashboard, twitching and turning to indicate the steam pressure building within the unseen boiler of your soul. To spend your life trying to turn the dial with your fingers while ignoring the fire in the boiler is the supreme definition of wasted labor. In the mid-14th century, during the construction of the grand cathedrals of Northern Europe, there lived a master stonemason and architect named Gabriel of the Iron Hand. Gabriel had been commissioned by the High Council of Saint Denis to design a cathedral that would surpass every structure in Christendom. For 7 years he labored over his drafting tables, laying out plans for soaring ribbed vaults that would rise 200 feet into the air without thick buttresses to block the light, creating walls that seemed woven entirely of stained glass and celestial fire. Before the first stone could be laid, a political coup swept the province. The rival faction seized the city, burned Gabriel's workshop, and cast the master builder into the subterranean dungeons beneath the fortress of Cheteletta, pitch-black labyrinth carved out of wet limestone beneath the bed of the river. There was no light in Gabriel's cell. The damp air tasted of saltpeter and decay. His hands, once accustomed to handling fine quills and brass calipers, were shackled to the stone wall with heavy iron rings. For the first year of his confinement, Gabriel fought the cold stone. He cursed his captors, pulled against the iron until his wrists were torn to the bone, and wept into the black silence of the cavern. He was a builder who had been robbed of his stone, his timber, his parchment, and his light. He felt himself rotting from within, his mind collapsing into the identical shape of his damp, suffocating cell. Then, on a freezing midnight during his second winter, a profound and absolute silence descended upon Gabriel's spirit. He realized that though his body was pinned to the limestone wall by 50 pounds of iron, his mind was entirely unbound. The guards could lock the door, they could withhold the torchlight, they could deny him paper and ink, but they could not take an inch of the invisible territory that existed behind his eyes. In that total unbroken darkness, Gabriel began to build. Every morning, when the distant prison bell tolled for the changing of the guard, Gabriel closed his physical eyes to the darkness and stepped into the grand cathedral within his soul. He did not merely picture the building from afar, he inhabited it. In the theater of his sovereign imagination, he walked up the marble steps of the west portal. He felt the cold, polished grain of the porphyry columns under his fingertips. He smelled the rich, resinous fragrance of frankincense and beeswax hanging in the warm air. He listened to the acoustics of the sanctuary, the long, 7-second reverb of choral voices echoing off the pointed limestone arches. He spent months working on a single rose window. In his mind, he selected each piece of cobalt and ruby glass, held it up to the imagined morning sun, and set it into the lead came. He climbed the spiral staircase of the bell tower, feeling the slight burn in his calves, the draft of cool wind against his forehead, and the deep brass vibration of the 4-ton bell tolling the Angelus. For 4 years, Gabriel lived in the cathedral. To the gods who brought his daily crust of dry bread, he was a silent, ragged prisoner wasting away in the dark. But within himself, Gabriel was the master of a soaring temple of light and gold. He lived in it so completely, so persistently, that the darkness of the cell ceased to register as real. It became nothing more than a thin, transparent garment draped over his true home. In the 6th year of his imprisonment, an unexpected plague broke out across the region. The reigning dynasty collapsed in chaos. The prison garrison fled their posts, leaving the gates unlocked. Gabriel walked out of the dungeon into the blinding light of the world. He was pale, his beard was long and white, and his clothes were tattered rags. He owned nothing. His previous workshop was ashes. His old patrons were dead. His original scrolls had vanished decades ago. Yet within 3 months of his emergence, the new Duke of the province, having heard rumors of the legendary builder who had survived the catacombs, summoned Gabriel to his court. The Duke desired to build a great basilica on the northern ridge to commemorate the end of the plague. "Master Gabriel," the Duke said, gesturing to a vast hall filled with blank parchment, dozens of apprentices, and mountains of reference scrolls, "how many years do you require to draw the plans for such a monument?" Gabriel looked at the Duke, his eyes clear and unbothered, carrying the serene gravity of a man who had already seen the end from the beginning. "My lord," Gabriel replied quietly, "the plans do not require a single day. The cathedral is already built. Every arch is keyed, every window is set, every column is measured to the millimeter. I have lived inside it for 4 years. We need only send the quarrymen to the hills to bring out the stones." Within 3 years, the Basilica of St. Gabriel rose upon the northern ridge. The masons marveled that Gabriel never consulted a drawing. He never hesitated before a complex vault. He never corrected a single arch. The physical stone was erected with breathtaking, effortless speed. Because it was not an experiment, it was merely the effortless, obedient translation of a monument that had already been brought to absolute perfection in the invisible dark. Look around the room where you currently sit. Notice the walls, the furniture, the windows, the clothing against your skin. Acknowledge this fundamental, unshakable law. Everything you can touch with your physical hands was once an invisible guest in human consciousness before it became a physical resident of the world. Your current life is no different. The life you are currently living is merely the outer translation of the state you have inhabited in the dark. If you desire to build a cathedral out of the wreckage of your current circumstances, you must cease looking to your physical conditions for permission. You must do what Master Gabriel did in the pitch-black catacomb. You must step past the shackles of what is and claim total authorship of the invisible. To cross this threshold today, execute the architect's protocol. 1. Secure the sanctuary of the invisible. Set aside a time today, preferably in the quiet threshold before sleep, where you shut down the report of the senses, turn off the glowing screens, dim the lights, close your eyes. Recognize that the moment your physical eyes are closed, the jurisdiction of your past ends. The bank balance disappears, the empty room vanishes, the entire historical ledger of your life is wiped clean. You are standing in the pristine, uncarved void of pure potential. 2. Stop visualizing, start inhabiting. This is where most seekers fail. They sit in the dark and look at their desire as though it were a painting hanging on a wall across the room. They picture themselves having money, picture themselves being loved, picture themselves being healthy. Do not look at the cathedral from the outside. Step across the threshold. Move inside the state. If you desire a healed and vigorous body, do not picture a healthy body across the room. Feel the spring in your step right now. Feel the deep, easy rhythm of your lungs. Feel the effortless strength in your spine. If you desire freedom, do not dream of the day it arrives. Feel the unhurried, calm tempo of a day in which your time belongs entirely to you. 3. Establish sensory familiarity and consciousness. Touch the invisible columns of your new reality. Smell the air of your desired life. Feel the ordinary, settled texture of a day in which your prayer is no longer a desperate plea but an accomplished fact. Stay there until the feeling of the wish fulfilled becomes so thick, so sweet, and so persuasive that your nervous system relaxes into absolute certainty. When you master this practice, you will discover the real secret of creation. You do not create a new life through strain, struggle, or violent effort in the material world. You simply move into the new life inwardly and let the outer world catch up to where you have already been. Yet, as you attempt this inward relocation, you will immediately encounter the most subtle and dangerous trap in the entire science of transformation. It is an error so quiet that 99% of people mistake it for genuine spiritual practice. It feels like devotion. It feels like passion. It feels like intense focus. Yet, beneath its surface, it broadcasts absolute ruin to the mirror of consciousness, ensuring that what you desire remains forever out of reach. What is this hidden trap that masquerades as manifestation? What is the profound, razor-thin difference between wishing for a reality and dwelling within it? To ensure your inner architecture never collapses into this fatal illusion, we must now examine the subtle mechanics of the art of inhabitation versus The trap of longing. A wet, sulfur-colored fog drifted through the iron alleys of a midwinter port. Outside the high, arched windows of a luxury confectionery, a shivering figure stood ankle-deep in slush. The air smelled of coal, soot, brine, and horse manure, but against the pane of glass, an entirely different world presented itself. Beneath crystal chandeliers, pyramids of candied chestnuts rested on gilded porcelain, marzipan fruits were dusted with edible gold, silver platters were piled high with warm, buttery brioche and chocolate steaming in porcelain urns. The shivering man pressed both bare hands flat against the cold plate glass. His breath blossomed against the exterior of the window, obscuring his vision, and he wiped the frost away with a trembling sleeve so he would not miss a single detail. He leaned closer. He imagined the sweet, dense pastry breaking between his teeth. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, trying to catch the phantom scent of roasted almonds slipping through the window sash. He sent every particle of his heart's desire through the barrier, whispering desperate, beautiful words of adoration toward the feast within. He wanted it with an intensity that made his ribs ache. He focused his mind upon it for hours, staring with such unblinking devotion that tears tracked through the grime on his cheeks. Yet, with every minute he stood before the window, sending his passionate longing across the barrier of the glass, he grew colder, wetter, and hungrier. The glass did not melt beneath the heat of his desire. The rolls did not fly into his hands. His desperate yearning did not build a bridge into the warm salon. It served only as a magnifying glass that made the frozen pavement beneath his torn boots feel infinitely more cruel. Inside the confectionery, seated at a corner table of polished mahogany, an elderly merchant in a beaverskin coat was finishing his breakfast. He did not stare at the brioche with wide-eyed adoration. He did not recite poetry about the honey glaze. He was reading a morning broadsheet, turning the printed pages with one hand while casually, almost mindlessly, breaking off a piece of warm pastry with the other and lifting it to his mouth. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving the shipping reports. He was entirely indifferent to the sweetness on his tongue. To him, the bread was not a miracle. It was not a distant dream to be worshipped from across a chasm of cold air. It was simply breakfast. It was the ordinary, unremarkable texture of an ordinary morning, in a life where breakfast was always guaranteed. Here lies the supreme invisible trap that ensnares 99 out of every 100 seekers. The hungry man on the pavement believes his burning desire is the currency that will purchase the feast. He believes that the hotter the fire of his wanting, the closer he comes to possession. He does not see that his very posture, his shivering stance, his face pressed against the cold glass, his aching longing for what lies over there is the absolute proclamation of his poverty. His longing does not draw the feast closer. His longing defines the chasm that keeps it away. A wet, sulfur-colored fog drifted through the iron alleys of a midwinter port. Outside the high, arched windows of a luxury confectionery, a shivering figure stood ankle-deep in slush. The air smelled of coal, soot, brine, and horse manure, but against the pane of glass, an entirely different world presented itself. Beneath crystal chandeliers, pyramids of candied chestnuts rested on gilded porcelain. Marzipan fruits were dusted with edible gold. Silver platters were piled high with warm, buttery brioche and chocolate steaming in porcelain urns. The shivering man pressed both bare hands flat against the cold plate glass. His breath blossomed against the exterior of the window, obscuring his vision, and he wiped the frost away with a trembling sleeve so he would not miss a single detail. He leaned closer. He imagined the sweet, dense pastry breaking between his teeth. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, trying to catch the phantom scent of roasted almonds slipping through the window sash. He sent every particle of his heart's desire through the barrier, whispering desperate, beautiful words of adoration toward the feast within. He wanted it with an intensity that made his ribs ache. He focused his mind upon it for hours, staring with such unblinking devotion that tears tracked through the grime on his cheeks. Yet, with every minute he stood before the window, sending his passionate longing across the barrier of the glass, he grew colder, wetter, and hungrier. The glass did not melt beneath the heat of his desire. The rolls did not fly into his hands. His desperate yearning did not build a bridge into the warm salon. It served only as a magnifying glass that made the frozen pavement beneath his torn boots feel infinitely more cruel. Inside the confectionery, seated at a corner table of polished mahogany, An elderly merchant in a beaver-skin coat was finishing his breakfast. He did not stare at the brioche with wide-eyed adoration. He did not recite poetry about the honey glaze. He was reading a morning broadsheet, turning the printed pages with one hand while casually, almost mindlessly, breaking off a piece of warm pastry with the other and lifting it to his mouth. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving the shipping reports. He was entirely indifferent to the sweetness on his tongue. To him, the bread was not a miracle. It was not a distant dream to be worshipped from across a chasm of cold air. It was simply breakfast. It was the ordinary, unremarkable texture of an ordinary morning in a life where breakfast was always guaranteed. Here lies the supreme invisible trap that ensnares 99 out of every 100 seekers. The hungry man on the pavement believes his burning desire is the currency that will purchase the feast. He believes that the hotter the fire of his wanting, the closer he comes to possession. He does not see that his very posture, his shivering stance, his face pressed against the cold glass, his aching longing for what lies over there, is the absolute proclamation of his poverty. His longing does not draw the feast closer. His longing defines the chasm that keeps it away. In the ancient imperial capital of Lysandria, the throne of the Sun dynasty had stood empty for 2 decades following the mysterious disappearance of the royal house. The Regency Council, desperate to restore order among the restless provinces, announced an imperial trial. Any claimant of royal blood who could prove their heritage by withstanding the sacred judgment of the Lion Throne of Alderaan would be crowned emperor. The throne was carved from a single block of star iron, set atop 7 tiers of black basalt in the Grand Hall of Pillars. Legend held that if an impostor sat upon the seat, the weight of the crown would break their neck. But if the true heir took the seat, the court would recognize the sovereign without a single word being spoken. 2 men stepped forward to claim the seat. The first was Lord Varys, a brilliant, charismatic general of the southern marches. Varys had dreamed of the crown since his youth. He had studied every treatise on imperial law. He had spent millions in gold to forge a replica of the coronation robes made of pure gold thread and velvet. He had practiced his regal gait for thousands of hours before towering mirrors. On the morning of his trial, Varys approached the grand hall, surrounded by fanfare, trumpet blasts, and a retinue of 50 retainers throwing rose petals before his path. He walked with an exaggerated, immaculate dignity, his chin raised high, his eyes burning with intense, desperate focus. He approached the 7 basalt tiers, his heart thundering against his ribs like a war drum. He climbed the steps, turned to face the thousands of assembled nobles, and sat upon the star iron throne. He strained with all his might to project majesty. He gripped the arms of the throne until his knuckles turned bloodless. He projected his chest forward. He fixed his face into a terrifying mask of divine authority. He desperately wanted them to see an emperor. He sent waves of commanding intention across the hall, silently screaming at the assembled crowd to fall to their knees. The grand hall remained dead silent. The nobles looked at him not with awe, but with cold, clinical scrutiny. They saw the trembling of his eyelid. They saw the white-knuckle grip upon the armrests. They saw the frantic, desperate longing of an outsider trying to force his way into a house that was not his own. The high prelate stepped forward, rested a hand upon the star iron, and said, "Step down, Lord Varys. You sit upon the throne as a beggar sitting on stolen gold. Your posture is the posture of a man who fears he will be discovered." Varys was led away in shame, the gold thread of his robes dragging across the stone floor. 3 days later, without heralds or trumpets, a quiet man named Aaron entered the grand hall at dusk. Aaron was a forester from the western ranges who had recently discovered the royal crest etched into the birth iron around his neck. He wore simple garments of unadorned gray wool, damp at the hem from the evening rain. He had no entourage, no gold thread, and no practiced speeches. He walked into the vast hall while the servants were lighting the tallow torches. The ministers and high lords stood in casual clusters along the perimeter, murmuring among themselves. Aaron did not look around the room to see who was watching. He did not brace his shoulders. He walked across the black basalt with the unhurried, natural stride of a man returning to his family library after a long walk in the rain. He ascended the 7 tiers without ceremony. He did not look at the star iron throne as though it were a sacred monster. He approached it as one approaches a familiar, comfortable chair. He sat down, leaned back against the high iron crest, and rested his forearm casually along the armrest. He did not strike a pose. He did not demand that anyone bow. He looked out at the vast hall with eyes that were utterly calm, slightly tired, and completely at rest. The silence that fell over the grand hall this time was not the cold judgment of an audience. It was the breathless, instinctive reverence of subjects recognizing their master. Before a single herald could blow a trumpet, before the high prelate could inspect his lineage, the entire assembly, ministers, generals, servants, and skeptics dropped to their knees upon the stone floor. They did not kneel because Aaron had commanded it. They knelt because his presence left them no other choice. He did not look like a man who wanted the throne. He looked like the throne had simply been waiting for him to sit down. Examine your own posture before the throne of your desires. Have you been approaching your ideal life like Lord Varys, pacing before the basalt steps, wearing the heavy, performative armor of desperate effort, gripping the armrests with white knuckles, and begging the universe to validate your claim? Or are you ready to walk into the hall like Aaron, dressed in the simple wool of quiet certainty, leaning back against the seat, because you know the throne was carved for you before the foundation of the world? The transition from the beggar at the window to the sovereign on the throne requires no physical effort. It requires only the quiet, inward courage to stop wanting and begin inhabiting. Tonight, before your head touches the pillow, enact the relocation protocol. 1. Identify the object of your longing. Bring to mind the reality you have been desperately trying to attract: the financial freedom, the romantic sanctuary, the creative breakthrough. Notice the subtle, aching gap you have maintained between yourself and that reality. Feel how you have been positioning it as a distant star in the sky of tomorrow. 2. Collapse the chasm. Step past the glass. Step off the cold pavement. Relocate your entire consciousness into the interior of that life now. Do not visualize yourself getting there. Do not visualize the phone call, the contract, or the celebration. Visualize the morning after the triumph. 3. Inhabit the settled texture of the ordinary. What does a Tuesday afternoon feel like when the financial struggle has been solved for 5 years? It does not feel like explosive, ecstatic fireworks. It feels like an unhurried exhale. It feels like the casual way you open your cupboards, the easy rhythm of your breath as you walk down the street, the slight, comfortable boredom of someone for whom abundance is no longer a miracle, but simply the way things are. Spend 30 seconds feeling that ordinary, settled texture. Touch the furniture of your fulfilled life in consciousness. Smell the morning air of your answered prayer. Feel the unbothered rhythm of your heart. When you can feel even a single drop of that casual certainty, you have changed your inner address. You have relocated in the only realm that matters. And yet, as you step into this sovereign inhabitation and open your eyes tomorrow morning, a fierce and disorienting storm will meet you at the threshold. The physical world will not transform in a flash of lightning. The old bills may still sit on the table, the empty room may still echo with silence, the body may still carry the dull ache of the old condition. Your mind, trained in the old habits of sensory tyranny, will point at these unchanged conditions and scream, "You see, it did not work. You are a fool living in a fantasy. Come back to reality." This is the most dangerous sacred crossroad in human existence, the gap. Why does the physical world lag behind the internal state? What is actually happening in the dark, silent soil of reality during those days and weeks when nothing seems to be moving? To survive this trial, without abandoning your seed, we must now step onto the open sea of the unseen, the holy interval, navigating the silent gap. A late November frost blankets the open fields of the northern valleys. Under a slate-gray sky, the earth lies hard as iron, silent and seemingly dead. A lone farmer stands at the edge of the furrowed earth, his hands buried deep within the pockets of a heavy woolen coat. Breath billows from his mouth in pale rhythmic clouds, dissolving into the freezing air. Beneath the crust of frozen mud and rotting leaves, 3 weeks prior, he dropped 10,000 seeds of winter wheat into the dark earth. Look closely at the field. To the naked eye, to every report of the 5 senses, absolutely nothing is happening. There is no green shoot breaking the crust. There is no tremor in the loam. There is no sound rising from the soil. If an observer from a desert land, someone who had never witnessed the cycles of sowing and harvest, were brought to this ridge, they would look upon the gray acreage with profound pity. They would see only a vast, barren graveyard where good grain had been foolishly thrown into the dirt and left to decay. They would declare the farmer a madman, a delusional eccentric standing vigil over an empty grave. Yet the farmer does not weep. He does not run into the field with an iron pick to hack apart the frozen clods. He does not drop to his knees, scrape away the dirt, and pull the seeds into the sunlight to shout at them, demanding that they sprout on his command. He stands in the biting wind, looks upon the silent, unresponsive earth, and feels an unshakable, profound peace. He knows what the senses cannot register. The silence of the soil is not the silence of death. It is the silence of profound subterranean architecture. Beneath the frozen crust, in the pitch-black sanctuary of the earth, the outer husk of the seed has split. Invisible micro-roots are threading their way through the mineral dark, locking into moisture, anchoring the living organism into the bedrock of the valley. The work is not absent. The work is happening in the only place where real creation can ever take place, in the dark, beneath the threshold of appearance. This is the great, terrifying crucible of human transformation. The gap, an individual resolves to live from the wish fulfilled. In the private theater of consciousness, they step out of the old identity of lack and inhabit the sovereign certainty of the answered prayer. They feel the relief, they touch the reality, they go to sleep in the quiet certainty of possession. Then the sun rises, the individual opens their eyes to the morning. They look around the room, and the peeling wallpaper remains peeling. They check the mailbox, and the old bills remain unpaid. They look in the mirror, and the lines of exhaustion have not miraculously vanished overnight. And in that precise, silent moment, the modern mind collapses in panic. It looks at the unchanging surface of the world, concludes that the law has failed, and digs up the seed in a frenzy of doubt, throwing itself back into the familiar chains of cynicism. To survive the crossing of the gap, one must understand the precise physics of temporal delay in a material universe. Why does the outer world refuse to shift? The instant consciousness relocates to a new state. The answer lies in understanding that the physical plane is a medium of high density and structural momentum. Matter is not agile. It is sluggish. It is consciousness condensed into extreme deceleration. When you throw a pebble into a pond, the ripples take time to travel to the distant reeds at the perimeter. The water does not move instantaneously across the entire surface because the medium possesses mass, viscosity, and inertia. When an individual adopts an assumption and holds it for 5, 10, or 20 years, that assumption sets an immense quantity of physical momentum into motion. It organizes careers, neural pathways, financial agreements, emotional attachments, and physical habits. It weaves a dense, interlocking tapestry of material circumstances. That tapestry is not an abstract concept. It is an organized, heavy structure in time and space. When consciousness shifts its address, what happens to this accumulated momentum? The severing of the root. The moment an individual truly assumes the wish fulfilled, the energetic fuel line to the old reality is cut instantly. The old tree has been severed from its life source in the invisible, the lingering greenery. Yet, just as a felled pine tree retains green needles and sticky sap for weeks after the axe has severed its trunk, the physical circumstances of the old state continue to exist on residual momentum. The bills arrive because they were generated 30 days ago. The emotional friction lingers because the relational dynamics were set in motion weeks prior, the process of graceful unweaving. The law of consciousness does not violently shatter the physical universe to give you your new desire to do so, would tear the fabric of your daily life to pieces. Instead, the law begins a quiet, masterful, often invisible rearrangement of conditions. It closes doors that no longer serve you. It dissolves old alliances. It shifts meetings. It reconfigures the invisible architecture of your life with supreme mathematical elegance. Why does the human intellect interpret this graceful interval as failure? Because the intellect is addicted to immediate sensory confirmation. The untrained mind operates on the primitive logic of a small child. If I cannot see it right now, it does not exist. When the senses report that the circumstances are unchanged, the individual looks at the silence of the soil and says, "Nothing is happening." In saying nothing is happening, they adopt the assumption of an empty field. Consciousness, forever obedient, accepts this fresh command and stops the germination process in its tracks. They dug up the seed to see if it was growing, and in the very act of digging, they killed the sprout. The gap is not an obstacle to creation, the gap is the creation. It is the necessary interval during which the invisible reality roots itself into the dense soil of the material world. The absence of outer movement is not evidence of absence. It is the absolute guarantee that the movement is occurring where it matters most, in the unseen depths of the machine. In the spring of 1888, the grand transatlantic steamship Leviathan was charting its course through the icy, fog-draped waters of the North Atlantic. Weighing 45,000 tons, with hulls of riveted Scottish steel and reciprocating steam engines generating 30,000 horsepower, the Leviathan was the heaviest moving object ever constructed by human hands. She was cutting through the swells at 22 knots, her four massive bronze propellers churning the ocean into a towering wake of white foam. At 2 bells into the midnight watch, the lookout in the crow's nest struck the brass bell 3 times and shouted through the speaking tube, "Icefield dead ahead." Standing upon the enclosed bridge, Captain Matthew Vance did not panic. He stepped to the brass engine order telegraph, grasped the polished levers, and pulled them back with a clean metallic clatter, full reverse. 300 feet below the waterline, deep in the sulphurous heat of the boiler rooms, the engineers threw open the steam bypass valves. The colossal pistons shuddered, halted for a breathless second, and began to drive the crankshafts in the opposite direction. The bronze propellers bit into the water backwards, boiling the dark sea into a roaring fury of counter-thrust. On the bridge, Captain Vance stood with his hands resting lightly upon the brass binnacle, his eyes fixed on the grey silhouettes of the icebergs rising out of the fog 2 miles ahead. Beside him stood the young third mate, his face white with terror, his hands trembling violently against the navigational chart. "Captain," the young mate screamed over the roar of the wind, "the ship is still rushing forward. Look at the wake, look at the ice coming closer. We haven't slowed by a single knot. The reverse order has failed. The engines are broken." The young man reached frantically for the telegraph levers, desperate to wrench them back and forth, desperate to do something with his hands to force the colossal vessel to a halt. Captain Vance caught the junior officer's wrist with a grip like an iron clamp. He did not raise his voice. His eyes were cold, steady, and clear as a winter dawn. "Keep your hands off the levers, Mr. Hastings," Vance commanded quietly. "But sir," Hastings gasped, pointing through the salt-sprayed glass. "We are charging toward the ice. Nothing has changed. The bow is still cutting the water. We are going to be crushed." "Listen to me, boy," Vance said, his voice cutting through the young man's hysteria. 45,000 tons of steel traveling at 22 knots does not stop like a carriage on a cobblestone street. The momentum of our past speed must be spent upon the water. The engines have already reversed. The screws are turning with everything they have. Deep beneath our feet, the past is dying, and the future is taking hold. The captain pointed out to the sea, alongside the hull. "Look closely at the water near the midships. The forward bow wave is flattening. The foam is churning beneath the keel. The ship appears to be rushing ahead to your eyes, but every foot she travels is being fought for and won by the reverse thrust. The work is done. Now we hold the course and let the mass settle." For 4 agonizing minutes, the Leviathan surged forward through the black swells, seemingly indifferent to the colossal war being waged in her belly. The icebergs loomed larger, their blue-white spires rising like cathedral ruins above the fog. To the terrified eyes of the junior mate, they were rushing into oblivion. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the deep vibration of the hull changed pitch. The bow wave collapsed. The roaring wake died. The ship shuddered, groaned through its iron ribs, and came to an absolute dead halt in the black water 200 yards from the towering wall of the ice field. The Leviathan did not strike the ice. She had stopped not because of a frantic last-second maneuver on the bridge, but because 4 minutes earlier, in the unseen depths of the ship, an absolute decision had been executed and held without flinching through the terrifying momentum of the gap. You are the captain upon the bridge of your own destiny. When you make the sovereign choice to reverse your inner assumption, to turn away from lack, from illness, from limitation, and to assume the quiet reality of the wish fulfilled, you have thrown the telegraph into full reverse. In the unseen depths of your consciousness, the engines of creation have already responded. The subtle forces of the universe are turning with infinite power, unweaving the old momentum and anchoring the new course. Yet, as you walk through today, the physical ship of your life will appear to surge forward into the familiar waters of your past. The bills will arrive, the old sensations in the body will speak. The well-meaning cynics will ask you why nothing has changed yet. The terrified junior mate inside your own intellect will scream, "It isn't working, the engines have failed, we are rushing into the ice." In that precise moment, you must remember the calm hand of Captain Vance. You must keep your hands off the levers. To navigate the holy interval today without sabotaging your manifestation, execute the sanctuary protocol. 1. Reframe the unchanged conditions. When an old, undesirable circumstance appears today, refuse to interpret it as a failure of the law. Look upon it with the cool the water is settling. I give this lingering wave no power to turn my helm. 2. Never dig up the seed. Do not go hunting for evidence. Stop checking your bank balance every 20 minutes with an anxious pulse. Stop looking into the mirror with frantic eyes to see if the healing has appeared. Stop scanning the faces of others to see if they approve of you yet. The moment you check for evidence with anxiety, you step off the throne of possession and climb back down into the beggar's ditch of longing. Trust the dark soil. Let the invisible roots do their subterranean work in peace. 3. Remain in the state of sovereign rest. Your only duty during the gap is to remain. When the voice of fear tells you that you are a fool, do not argue with it. Simply smile, return your awareness to the quiet, settled feeling of the wish fulfilled, and continue your day with the unhurried certainty of a farmer who knows that winter always, inevitably, surrenders to the harvest. Yet, even as you resolve to hold the bridge and trust the soil, a formidable adversary will step out from the shadows of your own mind. It is not an external enemy. It is the hardened battle, scarred part of your own psyche, the voice of the wounded skeptic. It is the part of you that tried this before, that hoped with an open heart, that was crushed by disappointment, and that now wears cynicism like a suit of heavy plate armor to ensure it is never hurt again. That skeptic is sitting with crossed arms, watching your every move, preparing to ask the ultimate devastating question, is this not simply an elaborate form of self-deception? How do we answer the wounded cynic? How do we disarm the skeptic's armor without breaking their heart? To resolve this ancient inner war once and for all, we must now confront the skeptic's armor and the greater truth. A low fire burned in the hearth of an ancient stone library, throwing long amber shadows across walls lined with leather-bound treatises. In the deepest alcove of the room, half submerged in darkness, sat a solitary figure with arms tightly folded across his chest. He did not lean forward into the warmth of the flames. He did not reach for the parchment on the table before him. His eyes were narrowed, sharp as ground obsidian, scanning every corner of the room with cold, clinical vigilance. He was wearing an old suit of iron plate armor. The metal was heavy, scarred with deep notches from ancient broadswords, and rusted at the joints where old rain and dried blood had settled years ago. It squeaked with every shallow breath he took, biting into the flesh of his collarbone, weighing down his shoulders with 60 pounds of dead iron. To move was agony. To sit was exhausting. To sleep was impossible. Yet, when a companion approached with an iron key and oil to help him unbuckle the breastplate, the man recoiled violently. His hand dropped to the pommel of his dagger. His knuckles turned white against the hilt. "Leave the buckles alone," the armored man growled, his voice rasping through the visor slits like gravel dragged across iron. "You call this weight a burden. I call it survival. Outside these walls, there are archers in the brush. I have stood upon the field with an open tunic before. I have believed in promises. I have charged the line with hope in my throat, and I have carried the barbed iron home in my ribs. Never again. The armor stays on. It is heavy, it is cold, and it is suffocating, but it guarantees that no blade will ever touch my heart again. Look upon this armored sentinel with profound, unsparing compassion. He is not a villain. He is not a fool. He is not spiritually lazy. He is the wounded skeptic who resides within every human breast. He is the part of the psyche that dared to hope, once the part that visualized the dream, that stood in the light of expectation, and that met the cold, shattering blow of apparent failure. In the aftermath of that heartbreak, he retreated into the fortress of cynicism. He forged a philosophy of realism out of the shrapnel of his old wounds. He adopted a solemn creed: if I expect nothing, I can never be crushed. If I assume I am unlovable, abandonment will carry no surprise. If I assume poverty is my lot, the unpaid bill will not break my spirit. He sits in the dark, watching this sacred teaching unfold, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He prepares his final, desperate assault upon the truth. He leans forward and spits the accusation that has paralyzed millions of searching souls. Is this not merely an elaborate form of lying to yourself? Is living from the wish fulfilled not the definition of delusion? To liberate the armored skeptic, one must not dismiss his question with hollow spiritual platitudes. One must meet his challenge with devastating, rigorous philosophical honesty. Is assuming the wish fulfilled a form of self-deception? The answer, in a strict, technical sense, is yes. Yet, here is the profound, earth-shattering reality that the skeptic's armor is designed to hide. Every single thought, identity, and belief you have ever held in your life is also a self-deception. Trace the recursive architecture of human identity down to its bedrock foundation, the myth of objective identity. When an individual states with absolute certainty, "I am not the kind of person who succeeds," or "my family has always struggled with money," or "I am fundamentally unlucky," they believe they are reporting objective, empirical facts. They believe they are describing unalterable reality, the invention of the story. Where did those facts originate? They were never written into the laws of physics. They are not stamped into the periodic table of elements. They are stories, assumptions born from a single interpreted experience in childhood, a cultural narrative, or an emotional scar. The repetition into solidity. The individual repeated that story 10,000 times in the dark. They repeated it until the narrative wore a deep groove into the neural substrate of the brain. They repeated it until consciousness accepted it as an absolute decree and built a matching life around it. The seduction of the true. Because the physical mirror obediently produced circumstances that matched the story, the individual pointed to the physical evidence and declared, "This story is the absolute truth of who I am." Examine the staggering hypocrisy of this mental mechanism. The human mind has been fabricating illusions every single day of its existence. It invents limitations out of thin air, baptizes them as realism, and defends them to the death. It takes a handful of past disappointments and turns them into a lifetime prison sentence, claiming it is merely being honest about how things are. Why then does the mind brand the assumption of lack as honest reality, while branding the assumption of abundance as dangerous self-deception? Because the ego is addicted to familiar suffering over unfamiliar sovereignty. The ego feels a perverse sense of safety in its misery because misery has an established history. It is measurable. It has boundaries. It requires no courage to say, "I will probably fail." If you fail, your prediction was accurate, your ego remains an infallible prophet, and your armor remains intact. To say, "I am whole, I am sovereign, I am abundantly supplied," in the presence of an empty bank account feels terrifying because it strips away the armor. It exposes the individual to the vast, unmapped ocean of pure potential where there are no familiar walls to lean against. Now, confront the plainest, most rational question available to an intelligent human being. If you are forced, by the inescapable nature of your own mind, to assume something, if you are incapable of observing reality without casting an interpretive narrative over the void, if every identity you inhabit is an engineered garment of consciousness, why on earth would you choose to assume the lesser version? Why would you choose the assumption that makes you small, that breaks your spirit, that suffocates your genius, and that confirms your deepest fears? To assume scarcity is not noble. It is not humble. It is not realistic. It is the tragic, unnecessary choice to use your infinite, God-given creative power to construct your own dungeon. The truly delusional person is not the visionary who lives from the wish fulfilled. The truly delusional person is the one who assumes poverty while waiting for wealth, who assumes isolation while waiting for love, and who sits in an unlocked cell cursing the bars that exist only in his own imagination. In the mountain citadel of Viridian, there stood the ancient vault of the Iron Gate. For 40 years, a political prisoner named Silas had lived within its subterranean cell. The chamber was 6 paces wide, carved out of the cold granite heart of the mountain. Silas wore heavy iron chains around his ankles, their links rusted orange from the dampness that seeped through the stone. His routine was unalterable. Every morning he counted the damp cracks in the ceiling. Every noon he ate a bowl of cold pulse left by the guards. Every evening he dragged his chains across the floor to the single iron door, checked the massive brass padlock on the outside latch, and wept into the silence. He knew every contour of his prison. He knew that the third stone from the corner was loose. He knew that the draft from the ceiling blew coldest when the moon was full. He knew that the iron door was 4 inches of solid oak bound in bands of black iron. He took a dark, bitter pride in his knowledge of the cell. When younger prisoners were tossed into adjacent chambers, screaming and begging for mercy, Silas would call out through the ventilation grate with the dry, authoritative voice of a veteran, "Save your breath, boys. The mountain does not negotiate. The oak is thick, the chains are real, the guards have no hearts. I have measured every inch of this stone for 40 years. Settle into the cold. The sooner you learn that this floor is your only world, the less it will hurt when you die upon it." He called his counsel the hard wisdom of the cage. He believed he was saving them from the agony of false hope. In the 41st year of his imprisonment, an earthquake shook the foundations of the mountain. Deep within the stone corridors, a support beam shifted. The ancient brass padlock on Silas's door cracked and fell to the flagstones with a dull, hollow thud. The heavy oak door swung open 3 inches, revealing the sunlit corridor, beyond a corridor that led directly to an unguarded terrace overlooking green valleys, wild rivers, and an endless golden sky. Silas sat up on his straw pallet. He heard the door creak open. He smelled the fresh, clean air, the scent of pine needles, wild clover, and warm sunlight pouring into his damp tomb. He stood up, his chains rattling around his ankles, and walked slowly to the door. He peered through the 3-inch gap. He saw the golden light washing over the corridor floor. He saw the open gateway at the end of the hall. He saw that there was not a single guard, not a single barrier, not a single lock between his chains and total absolute freedom. He stood frozen on the threshold for an hour, his hand trembling against the rough oak. The warm breeze brushed against his pale face, and a sudden, violent terror seized his chest. "What is out there?" His mind screamed. "There are wolves in the forest. There are bandits on the roads. I have no coin. I have no trade. I have no family left in the valley. If I step out there and starve, I will die a fool who thought he was a free man." He looked back over his shoulder at the dark, wet cell. The stone floor was cold, but it was his floor. The cracks in the ceiling were ugly, but he knew their exact numbers. The bowl of cold pulse was tasteless, but it arrived every day at noon with mechanical certainty. Silas reached out with his scarred hands, grabbed the iron handle of the door, and pulled it shut. He leaned against the wood until the heavy iron latch clicked back into place. He walked back to his straw pallet, sat down, wrapped his chains around his shins, and closed his eyes. That evening, when a new prisoner in the neighboring cell wept for the sunlight, Silas called out through the grate, his voice louder, firmer, and more fiercely confident than ever before. "Be silent, fool! You know nothing of the world. I went to the door today. I inspected the perimeter. I looked upon the horizon with my own eyes, and I tell you there is nothing out there but barren rock and certain death. We are prisoners because the world is an iron cage. I am a realist, boy. Be glad for the stone beneath your back." Silas died in that room 10 years later, clutching his rusted chains to his chest, convinced to his final breath that he had been the only honest man in the citadel. Take a moment of profound, cinematic stillness. If this mirror of truth has dismantled the defensive armor of your own cynicism, pause right now to like this chapter and share it with someone who is currently trapped in the cold comfort of their own unlocked cell. When you subscribe to this sanctuary, you align yourself with a global family of sovereign minds who have chosen to lay down their chains and step into the boundless light of the possible. Look at the heavy door of your own life. It has been unlocked for years. The earthquake of this teaching has shattered every padlock that ever held you. The only thing keeping you inside the damp cell of limitation is the rusted armor of your own realistic objections. The time has come to strip away the armor. To disarm the wounded skeptic and step across the threshold of the open gate today, execute the sovereign absolution protocol. 1. Honor the armor's past service. Do not hate your cynicism. Do not attack your inner skeptic. Recognize that he was forged in a moment of deep pain to protect a tender heart that did not yet understand the law. Place your hand upon your chest, speak directly to that guarded part of your soul and say, I thank you for keeping me safe when I was blind to my power. You carried the iron so I would survive the winter. But the war is over, the gate is open, I relieve you of your watch today. 2. Expose the inverted lie. Whenever your mind attempts to drag you back into scarcity, fear, or self-pity under the banner of being realistic, stop it immediately. Unmask the mechanism. Say aloud, this limitation is not an objective fact. It is merely an old story I have practiced until it felt real. If I have the power to make a nightmare feel solid, I have the power to make my divine inheritance 10 times more real. 3. Step into the golden light. Choose the higher assumption. Walk out of the dark room of your past ledger. Step into the expansive, sunlit reality of the wish fulfilled. Assume wealth, assume radiant vitality, assume profound, transcendent love. Do not ask for proof before you step out. The proof is waiting for you in the sunlight of your sustained conviction. Yet, as you stand in the golden light outside the open gate, the final, supreme discipline of the master must be mastered. It is not enough to walk out of the cell for an afternoon. It is not enough to take off the armor for an hour of inspiration, only to put it back on the moment a cold wind blows across the valley. The difference between the wanderer who collapses on the road and the sovereign who builds an empire lies in a single, unglamorous, unwitnessed capacity: persistence. Why do 99% of seekers fail after understanding these majestic principles? What is the single mistake that turns a planted seed into a forgotten graveyard? To ensure your new world takes unshakable root, we must now examine the sovereign art of persistence. In the subterranean vault of a forgotten alchemical laboratory, the air hung thick with sulfur vitriol and the oily smoke of black tallow candles. Mounds of leather-bound folios lay scattered across flagstones, their vellum margins crammed with cryptic sigils, geometric diagrams, and planetary alignments. Glass alembics hissed over charcoal braziers, mercury bubbled in copper retorts, complex distillations drip-drop by rhythmic drop into crystal vials. At the center of this frantic chaos stood an alchemist. His hair was streaked with ash, his fingers were stained black with silver nitrate, his eyes were bloodshot from 4 nights without sleep. He held an ancient parchment in his shaking hands. The scroll promised an arcane secret, the 7th transmutation, a precise sequence of 14 words, whispered while turning an iron key counterclockwise over a crucible of molten lead, guaranteed to spark the golden fire in a single breath. The alchemist recited the words. He turned the key, the iron clicked, the smoke parted. The crucible remained dull, heavy and gray, pure, cold lead. He dropped the key and collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his soot-stained hands. He wept into the dark, cursing the cosmos, cursing the authors of the scrolls, cursing the unresponsiveness of the earth. He had tried 300 techniques. He had meditated on sacred geometric seals. He had recited Latin incantations backwards at the full moon. He had fasted on mountain peaks and burned cedar resins imported from the Eastern empires. He had gathered every advanced method the civilized world possessed. Yet beside him in the corner of the laboratory, the true crucible lay stone cold. The furnace hearth beneath it was empty. The charcoal had burned down to fine white ash 2 days prior and had never been replenished. The alchemist had spent thousands of hours searching for an esoteric shortcut, a magical phrase, an elusive breathing method, a rare gemstone, while entirely neglecting the only operational requirement of the fire, the unglamorous, steady, unbroken addition of ordinary fuel to the coals. This is the great seductive distraction that paralyzes the modern seeker of transformation. Humanity searches endlessly for an advanced technique. Seekers attend seminar after seminar, read book after book, collect morning routines, test new frequencies, and swap visualization frameworks like children trading decorative stones. They believe with absolute desperation that their lives remain stagnant because they have not yet discovered the secret method, the missing ritual that will unlock the treasure house of reality without requiring them to remain steadfast in the dark. They never look at the cold hearth. They do not see that there is no secret technique. There is no formula hidden in an obscure manuscript. There is no morning ritual or special sequence of spoken words that holds the key to reality. The entire library of human wisdom, followed to its irreducible core, points to a single, unglamorous, supreme capacity: persistence in the assumption. To master the art of persistence, one must strip away the romantic myths surrounding spiritual manifestation and inspect the mechanical physics of internal stability. Why do 99% of individuals who understand the principles of consciousness fail to see their desires harden into physical reality? They fail not because they cannot imagine the wish fulfilled. They can. They do it with vivid passion on a Sunday evening. They do it with tears of inspiration on a Monday morning. They do it inside the warm sanctuary of a guided meditation. They fail because they cannot remain in that imagination when Tuesday presents them with the unchanged sensory report of the old world. Examine the recursive cycle of the spiritually impatient mind, the transient spark. An individual assumes a higher state. In consciousness, they inhabit wealth, radiant health, or profound harmony. For 20 minutes, they feel the relief and certainty of the answered prayer. The seed is dropped into the fertile, unseen soil of consciousness. The sensory collision. Hours later, an external circumstance contradicts the new state. A dismissive email arrives. The account balance shows a deficit. The physical body aches. The sudden abdication. The untrained mind, addicted to immediate sensory validation, panics. It interprets the old momentum as evidence that the new assumption was a fantasy. It says it didn't work. I am still here. The digging of the seed. By concluding it didn't work, the individual steps off the throne of possession. They vacate the new address. They step directly back into the old identity of lack and begin digging up the seed to analyze why it failed to sprout in 12 hours. The stagnant loop. On Friday, feeling a fresh wave of despair, they reach for a new technique, a different affirmation, a new meditation method, and drop another seed into the ground, only to dig that one up 48 hours later. The individual wanders through their life wondering why their circumstances have the eerie, claustrophobic quality of a room that never changes. They blame the soil, they blame the law, they conclude that they are uniquely cursed or spiritually inadequate. The soil did not fail, the soil did not refuse to grow the harvest. The gardener simply refused to leave the field alone long enough for the roots to grip the bedrock. What is persistence when understood as an operational law? Persistence is not strain, it is not grit, it is not the white-knuckled, teeth-gritting effort of an ego trying to force the universe into compliance through sheer willpower. Persistence is simply the quiet refusal to vacate your internal address. It is the discipline of a sovereign ruler who has declared a decree and considers the matter entirely closed. When the old sensory data screams for attention, the persistent mind does not wage a dramatic war against the noise. It simply smiles, treats the noise as the fading echo of a dead past, and returns its attention to the quiet certainty of the accomplished fact. Why does the return matter more than the slip? Because consciousness does not tally your slips. Consciousness is not an accountant of moments of doubt. Consciousness is an integrating engine of accumulated baseline assumption. If you slip into fear 10,000 times today, and you quietly, without self-condemnation, return to the wish fulfilled 10,001 times, you have won the day. Each return is an absolute vote cast for the new reality. The law counts the votes. It does not punish the tremors of the hand that drops the ballot into the box. The only failure possible in consciousness is the choice to stop returning, the choice to abandon the field entirely and declare that nothing is growing in the very dark where everything is being made. In the ancient imperial province of Shanli, at the base of the Iron Spine Mountains, stood the colossal black monolith of Kardun. The monolith was a solid, seamless boulder of black diorite, one of the hardest minerals on Earth. For centuries, it sat across the only mountain pass that connected the starving farming villages of the lowlands to the fertile river valleys of the west. Dynasties had attempted to clear the pass. Emperors had sent battalions of soldiers with copper levers and iron wedges, but the stone had shattered every tool, remaining unbothered, immovable, and unbroken. Among the mountain stonemasons lived Master Shen, an old man of few words whose hands were as weathered and gray as river slate. When the village elder approached Shen with tears in his eyes, begging him to open the pass before another winter locked the valley into famine, Shen did not ask for an army. He did not ask for black powder, nor did he consult the imperial geomancers for auspicious dates. He selected a single 4-pound iron hammer and an unadorned steel chisel. At dawn on the first day of spring, Shen walked up the pass and climbed upon the black monolith. He knelt upon the cold rock, placed the point of his steel chisel against the center of the boulder, raised his hammer, and struck. A sharp, metallic ring echoed through the gorge. A tiny puff of gray dust rose into the morning wind. The chisel left no mark upon the stone, not a fracture, not a groove, not a scratch. Shen adjusted his posture, reset the chisel, and struck again. Day after day, week after week, through scorching midday sun and driving mountain rain, the rhythm of Shen's hammer rang through the valley. Clink, clink, strike. He struck the stone 500 times before noon. He struck it 500 times before dusk. At the end of the first month, the villagers gathered at the base of the pass to inspect the progress. They climbed the scaffold and looked at the center of the stone. The surface of the black diorite was completely smooth. There was no crack. There was no visible indentation. To every eye, ear, and measuring tool in the province, 30,000 blows of the hammer had accomplished absolutely nothing. The younger stonecutters began to mock the old man. "Shen has lost his mind," they muttered, shaking their heads as they walked back to the village. "He uses a common hammer against a mountain stone. He should consult the southern alchemists for acid. He should build great timber fires to crack the rock with heat. He is wasting his breath on a dead effort." Shen did not look down at the villagers. He did not defend his methods. He did not strike the rock with frantic, desperate rage to prove his power. He simply lifted the hammer, placed the chisel against the exact same point, and struck. In the 5th month, a traveling scholar from the Imperial Academy passed through the gorge. He stopped his horse and watched the old man striking the unresponsive rock for 3 hours. The scholar climbed up to the ledge, his silk robes fluttering in the wind. "Old master," the scholar said with polite, intellectual pity, "I have calculated the tensile strength of black diorite. Your steel chisel cannot overcome the molecular density of this monolith with manual force alone. Look at the stone beneath your knees, 5 months of labor, and you have not produced a single fracture. Why do you continue to strike what refuses to yield?" Shen paused, lowered his hammer, and wiped the sweat from his gray brow with the back of his calloused hand. "Scholar," Shen said softly, his voice carrying the deep resonance of the mountain itself, "you look only at the surface of the stone. You believe that because the surface has not cracked, the blows have vanished into nothingness." Shen tapped the heavy iron head of his hammer against his own chest. "Every blow I have struck since the dawn of spring did not vanish. The shock wave of each strike traveled through the steel, entered the stone, and radiated into the dark heart of the rock. Deep within the core, where your eyes cannot see, the crystalline bonds are fracturing. The internal tension is accumulating with every strike. The stone is not resisting, it is storing the impact. It is holding the work." Shen raised his hammer once more. "The 100th blow does not split the rock because it was stronger than the first 99. It splits the rock because it inherits the weight of every strike that went before it." On the final evening of autumn, as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, Master Shen knelt upon the rock for the 10,000th time. The stone before him looked as solid, impenetrable, and unbroken as it had on the first morning of spring. Shen rested his chisel upon the point. He raised his hammer with an unhurried, calm, entirely ordinary motion, and let the iron fall. A sound like rolling thunder cracked through the gorge. A jagged, luminous fracture ripped across the center of the black diorite, shooting from the peak to the base like a bolt of white lightning. The 2 colossal halves of the monolith groaned, leaned outward, and crashed down the slopes on either side of the pass, shattering into manageable road gravel upon the valley floor. The pass was open. The road to the fertile river valleys lay clear under the evening stars, not because of an esoteric miracle, but because an old man had understood what it meant to remain with the hammer until the invisible accumulation became the visible fact. Every time you choose to assume the wish fulfilled in the face of contradictory evidence, you are Master Shen striking the black monolith. When you refuse to panic over an unpaid bill and instead quietly rest in the certainty of your abundance, you have struck the rock. When you walk past an empty room and refuse to validate the story of your permanent loneliness, choosing instead to feel the warmth of profound companionship within your soul, you have struck the rock. When you feel a familiar symptom in your body and refuse to crown it as your master, returning instead to the quiet feeling of radiant health, you have struck the rock. To the naked eye of the world, nothing appears to have changed. The circumstances may seem as dark, smooth, and unbroken as ever. The well-meaning cynics will ask you why you are still striking an immovable wall. Do not listen to them. Do not lower the hammer. To master the sovereign discipline of persistence today, execute the strike protocol. 1. The drama, free return. When you notice that your mind has wandered into the old territory of fear, lack, or self-doubt, and you will notice this many times, do not punish yourself. Do not stage an internal drama of failure. Do not say, I have ruined my manifestation. Simply treat the slip as the natural momentum of an old machine. Without a single word of guilt, quietly, gently, and immediately return your consciousness to the wish fulfilled. 2. Stop searching for the missing lever. Throw away the search for a superior technique. You do not need another method. You need only the willingness to remain in the state you have already chosen. Treat your inner assumption as a planted seed and leave the soil alone. Let the daily accumulation of your sustained conviction do its subterranean work in peace. 3. Count the returns, not the slips. Every time you return to the state of possession, consider it a deposit in an invisible treasury whose balance you cannot yet see. The law is accumulating the shock waves. The internal bonds of your old circumstances are fracturing beneath the surface. Hold your post. The crack is coming. And now, as the hammer falls day after day and the old stone begins to split from within, the final veil is ready to drop. You are about to discover the ultimate breathtaking secret of this entire journey. You will realize that you were never actually building a new reality out of thin air. You were never constructing a fantasy version of yourself to escape a painful life. You were doing something infinitely grander, infinitely more sacred. You were uncovering the version of you that has existed all along, the version that never bowed to the ledger, never wore the skeptic's armor, and never doubted its divine inheritance. Who is this sovereign presence waiting on the other side of your old assumptions? How does the living truth of your identity emerge, not as a new acquisition, but as a timeless memory? To step into the sanctuary of your eternal sovereignty, we now enter the final triumph, the emergence of the inevitable self. In the deepest sanctuary of an ancient imperial rotunda, a colossal form stood draped beneath a shroud of heavy, dust-laden indigo velvet. For 300 years, no mortal eye had seen what lay beneath the cloth. The hem of the veil was weighted down by heavy lead ingots, rusted and half buried in the mortar of the floorboards. The pilgrims who traversed oceans and deserts to reach this hall brought jars of oil, carved gold medallions, and rare resins. Placing them upon the stone steps before the covered pedestal, they knelt in the cold, echoing hall, weeping in the dark as they whispered their desperate prayers to the cloth. Give us form. Bestow upon us the grace we lack. Forge us into something noble, for we are hollow, broken, and unformed. They believed that inside the veil, a celestial artisan was still at work with hammer and rasp, slowly forging a divinity out of empty air. They believed that if they only suffered enough, wept long enough, and proved their worth through grueling piety, the artisan might one day complete the monument and grant them a glimpse of its glory. One midnight, a lone traveler carrying an iron crowbar approached the pedestal. He did not bring oil, he did not chant the liturgies of unworthiness. He walked up the 7 tiers of porphyry stone with an unhurried, measured stride. He slipped the cold iron beneath the lead weights, prying them from the stone with a single sharp crack. He reached up, grasped the coarse indigo fabric with both hands, and pulled downward with the deliberate, calm authority of an owner opening his own window to the morning. The velvet shroud tore down its center seam, cascading to the flagstones in a heavy wave of dust. The pilgrims gasped, shielding their eyes in terror, expecting to find an empty pedestal, a half-chiseled torso, or a monstrous, unfinished lump of stone. Standing in the pale silver light of the full moon was a sculpture of breathtaking, absolute perfection. The statue was carved from a single block of translucent crystalline marble. Its features were completely smooth, its posture effortless, its eyes open in an expression of unshakable, timeless sovereignty. There were no chisel marks upon its brow. There was no artisan hiding in the shadow behind the pedestal. There was no wet clay waiting to be shaped. The monument had not been forged in the dark during the years of their weeping. It had not been manufactured by an external god as a reward for their suffering. The statue had been sitting in the dark, whole, radiant, and complete since the foundation of the world. It had been waiting with the majestic, infinite patience of something that knew its nature was irrevocable, requiring nothing from the pilgrims except the courage to reach out and pull down the rag of their own making. This is the ultimate blinding revelation at the end of the human pilgrimage. Humanity spends its lifetime striving, struggling, praying, and manipulating conditions to become something greater. Individuals exhaust their bodies and minds attempting to construct a worthy self from the scraps of external validation. They do not see that the sovereign self is not an acquisition to be earned at the end of time. It is an eternal fact that has never ceased to exist beneath the veil of inherited assumptions. The version of you that is free, abundant, radiantly healthy, and deeply at peace is not a distant fantasy waiting to be manufactured. It is the uncarved reality of your consciousness, patiently waiting for you to stop identifying with the dust on the cloth. To arrive at the final summit of consciousness is to understand the profound metaphysical distinction between self-improvement and self-remembering. Why does the path of conventional self-improvement keep an individual locked in an endless, exhausting treadmill of inadequacy? Because the fundamental premise of trying to become contains the very poison that ensures failure. Trace the recursive architecture of the seeker's trap, the presumption of brokenness. When an individual embarks on a journey to fix themselves, their starting coordinate is, I am currently incomplete, flawed, and lacking the essential qualities of success. The seduction of the horizon. Operating from this premise, every practice, every meditation, every visualization, every technique is undertaken as a bridge to cross from the broken self to the ideal self in the future. The mirror's retort. Consciousness receives this perpetual broadcast. I am one who is striving, but does not yet possess. The mirror of reality, forever faithful, reflects the exact equivalent, a life of endless striving, endless searching, and permanent separation from the goal. The exhausting loop. The individual reads more, tries harder, and accumulates more spiritual knowledge, while remaining fundamentally at the same address of internal lack. By grasping the foundational law of identity, you cannot attract what you want, you can only express what you are. The sovereign self, the version of your life lived from the wish fulfilled, is not a newly minted identity. It is your default baseline reality when consciousness is no longer organized around the lies of limitation. Consider a piece of pure gold dropped into a pit of black mud. The mud cakes around the metal. It covers its luster. It obscures its color. It smells of decay. A passerby looking into the pit might declare that the gold has become clay. But did the gold ever truly lose its atomic structure? Did it ever forget its density, its malleability, or its radiance? The moment the water washes the mud away, the gold does not need to practice being gold. It does not need to attend seminars on how to shine. It simply is gold. The radiance was never lost. It was merely concealed by a substance that was never truly part of its nature. Your struggles with poverty, illness, heartbreak, and unworthiness are nothing more than the mud of inherited conditioning. They are the stories passed down by ancestors who lived in terror of the ledger. They are the defensive armors forged by a wounded ego. They are the echoes of a society that profits off your perceived inadequacy. When you step into the state of the wish fulfilled, you are not performing an act of unnatural magic. You are not deceiving yourself into an impossible grandeur. You are performing an act of cosmic remembering. You are stepping out of the mud and allowing your original, pristine identity to reassert its natural dominion. You are not building a palace. You are simply returning to the home you never truly left. In the high northern steppes of Eldoria, there lived a young falconer named Kyle. From the day he was found as a babe wrapped in coarse goat hides on the edge of the tundra, he was raised among the humble herdsmen of the border clans. He lived in low tents made of greasy hide. He ate dry barley meal. His hands were rough and scarred from gutting fish and handling hunting birds. His masters treated him as a common laborer. When the winter squalls swept down from the glaciers, Kyle was sent out into the snow to search for lost lambs. He bowed his head low when the clan elders rode past. He spoke in the quiet, hesitant cadence of a servant. He slept on a pile of sheepskins by the hearth ash, accepting that his lot was to live and die in the frozen dirt of the boundary lands. Yet, Every night as Kale lay in the dark, watching the red embers of the fire die, a strange and inexplicable sensation stirred within his chest. In the silence between his heartbeats, he did not feel like a herdsman. When he closed his eyes, the smell of grease and wet wool vanished. In its place, he smelled cedar smoke, polished leather, and cold mountain iron. He felt the weight of a heavy mantle upon his shoulders, not a mantle of coarse wool, but of thick white ermine and star silver. He saw a throne room built of gray granite arches, looking out over 7 fertile river valleys. He did not dream this as a fantasy. He knew it with the cold, quiet certainty with which a bird knows the path of the southern migration. In his 25th year, an imperial detachment of the royal guard rode into the border village. Their armor was forged of interlocking plates of midnight steel. Their war horses were tall and fierce. Their banners bore the ancient crest of the silver stag, the emblem of the High King of the North who had fallen in the great usurpation 25 years before. The captain of the guard dismounted in the village square. He did not look at the clan elders who fell to their knees in the mud. He walked straight to the sheep pens where Kyle was mending a leather tether. The captain stood before the young man, removed his iron helm, and fell to one knee in the slush. "Sire," the captain whispered, his voice trembling with a decade of searching, "the usurper has fled the capital. The council has verified the lineage mark upon your breast. The realm is in chaos, waiting for its sovereign. Your horse is saddled. Come home." The clan elders gasped, staring at the dirty laborer with terrified, uncomprehending eyes. They expected Kyle to weep, to tremble with shock, to ask 1,000 frantic questions, to stammer that there had been a mistake. Kale did not tremble. He lowered the leather tether to the timber rail. He wiped the dirt from his palms against his woolen trousers. He did not look at the captain with the bewildered gaze of a beggar handed a purse of gold. He looked down at the kneeling knight with eyes that were clear, calm, and infinitely steady. The hesitant, bowed posture of the herdsman fell away from his spine in a single, silent exhalation. His shoulders squared with natural, unforced authority. He looked toward the northern mountains, and the memory of the cedar smoke and the star-silver mantle locked into his physical body like a key sliding home in an oiled lock. "Rise, Captain," Kale said softly. His voice carried no strain, no performance, no artificial pomp. It was the unhurried, resonant command of a man who had never truly belonged to the sheepfold. Kyle did not need to learn how to ride the warhorse. He did not need to take lessons on how to hold the imperial broadsword. When they arrived at the capital and he walked through the great granite arches of the throne room, he did not look at the silver throne as though he were an intruder in a sacred hall. He walked up the dais, turned to face his court, and sat down upon the seat of his ancestors. He did not sit as one who had achieved a miraculous promotion. He sat as one who had returned from a long, tedious journey across a muddy road, effortless, settled, and undeniably home. You are Kyle standing in the sheepfold. For decades, the well-meaning herdsmen of your world, the cautious mentors, the cynical friends, the wounded voices of your own past have pointed at the mud upon your boots and told you that the sheepfold is the totality of your world. They have handed you the ledger of your past mistakes and commanded you to be realistic. They have pointed at the empty stalls and warned you not to hope. Tonight, the captain of the guard has arrived at your gate. The announcement has been made in the sovereign sanctuary of your own consciousness. The throne has always been yours. You do not need to fight the herdsmen. You do not need to convert the cynics or spend your life force arguing with the people who only know you by your old woolen coat. You need only do what Kyle did, lower the tether, step out of the mud, and claim the seat that was carved for you before the stars were flung into the dark. To enact this final permanent emergence tonight, execute the coronation protocol 1, the total relinquishment of the ledger. Take the record of your past, every failure, every heartbreak, every inherited story of limitation, and cast it into the fire of pure awareness. Refuse to consult it for another second. Speak directly to the dead past. You brought me to this threshold and your jurisdiction is finished. I no longer ask the footprint where the foot is allowed to walk. 2. Assume the sovereign countenance. Tonight, as you lay your head upon your pillow, do not pray as a beggar standing outside the palace gates. Do not visualize your dream from afar with the aching, hungry longing of the window shopper. Step onto the dais. Inhabit the reality of your fulfilled life with the casual, unhurried certainty of King Kyle resting against the granite throne. Feel the ordinary, settled texture of a life where your abundance, your vitality, and your deep, transcendent peace are simply the natural way things are. Feel the effortless rhythm of your breathing when the war is already over and the kingdom is already restored. 3. Rest in the accomplished fact. Close your eyes in the silence of your room, knowing with absolute mathematical certainty that the mirror of reality has no choice but to obey the face that looks into it. Do not wonder how the dawn will arrange the details. Do not check the darkness for signs of movement. Let the physical world unweave its old momentum in the silent gap. Let the invisible roots anchor deep into the bedrock of consciousness. You have returned to your true address. You have remembered the sovereign shape of who you are. Good evening. And may you sleep tonight in the feeling of the wish already fulfilled, not as a fleeting dream, not as a desperate plea, but as an absolute, eternal fact already accomplished in the only realm where reality is born.